Chapter 6, which concerns the colour blue. Charmaine sighed and stuffed the king's letter into her pocket. She did not feel like sharing whatever it said with Peter. "Why?" she said. "Why are they angry?" "Come and see," Peter said. "It all sounds ridiculous to me. I told them that you were in charge and they had to wait until you had finished being polite to those witches." "Witches?" said Charmaine. "One of them was my mother." "Well, my mother's a witch," Peter said, "and you only had to look at the proud one in silk to see that she was a witch. Do come on." He held the door open for Charmaine, and she went through, thinking that Peter was probably right about Aunt Sempronia. No one in the baker's respectable house ever mentioned witchcraft, but Charmaine had thought that Aunt Sempronia was a witch for years without ever putting it to herself so boldly. She forgot about Aunt Sempronia as soon as she entered the kitchen. There were kobolds everywhere. Little blue men with different shapes of large blue noses were standing anywhere there was a space on the floor that was not full of dog dishes or spilled tea. They were on the table between teapots and in the sink balanced on dirty dishes. There were little blue women, too, mostly perched on the laundry bags. The women were distinguished by their smaller, gentler noses and their rather stylish flounced blue skirts. "I'd like a skirt like that," Charmaine thought, only larger, of course. There were so many kobolds that it took Charmaine a moment to notice that the bubbles from the fireplace were nearly gone. All the kobolds raised a shrill shout as Charmaine came in. "We seem to have got the whole tribe," Peter said. Charmaine thought he was probably right. "Very well," she said above the yelling. "I'm here. What's the problem?" The answer was such a storm of yelling that Charmaine put her hands over her ears. "That'll do," she shouted. "How can I understand a word you say when you all scream at once?" She recognized the kobold who had appeared in the living room, standing on a chair with at least 6 others. His nose was a very memorable shape. "You tell me, what was your name again?" He gave her a curt little bow. "Timmins is my name. I understand you are a charming baker and you speak for the wizard, am I right?" "More or less," Charmaine said. There did not seem to be much point in arguing about her name. Besides, she rather liked being called charming. "I told you the wizard's ill. He's gone away to get cured." "So you say," Timmins answered. "Are you sure he hasn't run away?" This produced such yells and jeers from all over the kitchen that Charmaine had to shout again to get heard. "Be quiet! Of course he hasn't run away. I was here when he went. He was very unwell, and the elves had to carry him. He would have died if the elves hadn't taken him." In the near silence that followed this, Timmins said sulkily, "If you say so, we believe you, of course. Our quarrel is with the wizard, but maybe you can settle it, and I tell you we don't like it. It's indecent." "What is?" Charmaine asked. Timmins squeezed his eyes up and glowered over his nose. "You are not to laugh. The wizard laughed when I complained to him." "I promise not to laugh," Charmaine said. "So what is it?" "We were very angry," Timmins said. "Our ladies refused to wash his dishes for him, and we took away his taps so that he couldn't wash them himself. But all he did was smile and say he hadn't the strength to argue." "Well, he was ill," Charmaine said. "You know that now, so what is it about?" "This garden of his," Timmins said. "The complaint came first from Rollo, but I came and took a look, and Rollo was quite right. The wizard was growing bushes with blue flowers, which is the correct and reasonable colour for flowers to be, but by his magic he had made half the same bushes pink, and some of them were even green or white, which is disgusting and incorrect." Here Peter was unable to contain himself. "But hydrangeas are like that," he burst out. "I've explained it to you. Any gardener could tell you. If you don't put the bluing powder under the whole bush, some of the flowers are going to be pink. Rollo's a gardener. He must have known." Charmaine looked around the crowded kitchen, but could not see Rollo anywhere among the swarms of blue people. "He probably only told you," she said, "because he likes to chop things down. I bet he kept asking the wizard if he could chop the bushes down, and the wizard said no. He asked me last night." At this, Rollo popped up from beside a dog dish almost at Charmaine's feet. She recognized him mostly by his grating little voice when he shouted, "And so I did ask her, and she sits there in the path, having just floated down from the sky, cool as you please, and tells me I only want to enjoy myself. As bad as the wizard she is." Charmaine glared down at him. "You're just a destructive little beast," she said. "What you're doing is making trouble because you can't get your own way." Rollo flung out an arm. "Hear? Hear that? Who's wrong here? Her or me?" A dreadful shrill clamour arose from all over the kitchen. Timmins shouted for silence, and when the clamour had died into muttering, he said to Charmaine, "So, will you now give permission for these disgraceful bushes to be lopped down?" "No, I will not," Charmaine told him. "They're Great-Uncle William's bushes, and I'm supposed to look after all his things for him, and Rollo is just making trouble." Timmins said, squeezing his glower at her, "Is that your last word?" "Yes," said Charmaine, "it is." "Then," Timmins said, "you're on your own. No kobold is going to do a hand's turn for you from now on." And they were all gone, just like that. The blue crowd vanished from among teapots and dog dishes and dirty crockery, leaving a little wind stirring the last few bubbles about, and the fire now burning brightly in the grate. "That was stupid of you," Peter said. "What do you mean?" Charmaine asked indignantly. "You're the one who said those bushes were supposed to be like that, and you could see Rollo had got them all stirred up on purpose. I couldn't let Great-Uncle William come home to find his garden all chopped down, could I?" "Yes, but you could have been more tactful," Peter insisted. "I was expecting you to say we'd put down a bluing spell to make all the flowers blue or something." "Yes, but Rollo would still have wanted to cut them all down," Charmaine said. "He told me I was a spoil-sport last night for not letting him." "You could have made them see what he was like," Peter said, "instead of making them all even angrier." "At least I didn't laugh at them like Great-Uncle William did," Charmaine retorted. "He made them angry, not me." "And look where that got him," Peter said. "They took away his taps and left all his dishes dirty, so now we've got to wash them all without even any hot water in the bathroom." Charmaine flounced down into the chair and began again to open the King's letter. "Why have we got to?" she said. "I haven't the remotest idea how to wash dishes anyway." Peter was scandalized. "You haven't? Why ever not?" Charmaine got the envelope open and pulled out a beautiful, large, stiff, folded paper. "My mother brought me up to be respectable," she said. "She never let me near the scullery or the kitchen either." "I don't believe this," Peter said. "Why is it respectable not to know how to do things? Is it respectable to light a fire with a bar of soap?" "That," Charmaine said haughtily, "was an accident. Please be quiet and let me read my letter." She pulled her glasses up onto her nose and unfolded the stiff paper. "Dear Mistress Baker," she read. "Well, I'm going to get on and try," Peter said. I'm blowed if I'm going to be bullied by a crowd of little blue people, and I should think you had enough pride to help me do it." "Shut up," said Charmaine, and concentrated on her letter. "Dear Mistress Baker, how kind of you to offer us your services. In the normal way, we would find the assistance of our daughter, the Princess Hilda, sufficient for our need. But it so happens that the Princess is about to receive important visitors, and is obliged to forego her work in the library for the duration of the visit. We therefore gratefully accept your kind offer on a temporary basis. If you would be so good as to present yourself at the Royal Mansion this coming Wednesday morning at around 10:30, we shall be happy to receive you in our library and instruct you in our work. Your obliged and grateful Adolphus Rex Norlandi Alti." Charmaine's heart banged and bumped as she read the letter, and it was not until she reached the end of it that she realized that the amazing, unlikely, unbelievable thing had happened. The king had agreed to let her help him in the royal library. Tears came into her eyes. She was not sure why, and she had to whisk her glasses off. Her heart hammered with joy, then with alarm. Was today Wednesday? Had she missed her chance? She had been hearing, without attending, Peter crashing saucepans about and kicking dog dishes aside as he went to the inner door. Now she heard him come back again. "What day is it today?" she asked him. Peter set the large saucepan he was carrying down, hissing on the fire. "I'll tell you, if you tell me where he keeps his soap," he said. "Bother you," said Charmaine. "It's in the pantry, in a bag labelled something like caninitis. Now, what day is it?" "Cloths," said Peter. "Tell me where cloths are first. Did you know there are 2 new bags of laundry in this pantry now?" "I don't know where cloths are," Charmaine said. "What day is it?" "Cloths first," said Peter. "He doesn't answer me when I ask." "He didn't know you were coming," Charmaine said. "Is it Wednesday yet?" "I can't think why he didn't know," Peter said. "He got my letter." "Ask for cloths." Charmaine sighed. "Great-Uncle William," she said, "this stupid boy wants to know where cloths are, please." The kindly voice replied, "Do you know, my dear, I nearly forgot cloths. They're in the table drawer." "It's Tuesday," Peter said, pouncing on the drawer and dragging it open, almost into Charmaine's stomach. He said, as he fetched out wads of toweling and dishcloths, "I know it must be Tuesday because I set off from home on Saturday, and it took me 3 days to walk here. Satisfied?" "Thank you," Charmaine said. "Very kind of you. Then I'm afraid I'll have to go into town tomorrow. I may be gone all day." "Then isn't it lucky that I'm here to look after the place for you?" Peter said. "Where are you skiving off to?" "The king," Charmaine said with great dignity, "has asked me to go and help him. Read this, if you don't believe me." Peter picked up the letter and looked it over. "I see," he said. "You've arranged to be in 2 places at once. Nice for you. So you can darn well help me wash these dishes now, when the water's hot." "Why? I didn't get them dirty," Charmaine said. She pocketed her letter and stood up. "I'm going into the garden." "I didn't get them dirty either," Peter said. "And it was your uncle who annoyed the kobolds." Charmaine simply swept past him toward the living room. "You've got nothing to do with being respectable," Peter shouted after her. "You're just lazy." Charmaine took no notice and swept onward to the front door. Waif followed her, bustling appealingly around her ankles, but Charmaine was too annoyed with Peter to bother with Waif. "Always criticising," she said. "He's never stopped once since he got here. As if he was perfect," she said as she flung open the front door. She gasped. The kobolds had been busy, very quickly. True, they had not cut down the bushes because she had told them not to, but they had cut off every single pink bloom and most of the mauve or white ones. The front path was strewn with pink and lilac umbrellas of hydrangea flowers, and she could see more lying among the bushes. Charmaine gave a cry of outrage and rushed forward to pick them up. "Lazy, am I?" she muttered, as she collected hydrangea heads into her skirt. "Oh, poor great Uncle William, what a mess! He liked them all colours. Oh, those little blue beasts!" She went to tip the flowers out of her skirt onto the table outside the study window, and discovered a basket by the wall there. She took it with her among the bushes. While Waif scuttled and snorted and sniffed around her, Charmaine scooped up, snipped off hydrangea heads by the basket load. She chuckled rather meanly when she discovered that the kobolds had not always been certain which were blue. They had left most of the ones that were greenish, and some that were lavender-coloured, while there was one bush at which they must have had real trouble, because each flower on each of its umbrellas was pink in the middle and blue on the outside. To judge by the numbers of tiny footprints around this bush, they had held a meeting about it. In the end, they had cut the blooms off one half of the bush and left the rest. "See? It's not that easy," Charmaine said loudly, in case there were any kobolds around listening. "And what it really is vandalism, and I hope you're ashamed." She carried her last basketful back to the table, repeating "vandals, bad behaviour, little beasts," and hoping that Rollo at least was somewhere listening. Some of the biggest heads had quite long stalks. Charmaine collected those into a large pink, mauve and greenish-white bunch and spread the rest out on the table to dry in the sun. She remembered reading somewhere that you could dry hydrangeas, and they would stay the same colour and make good decorations for winter. Great Uncle William would enjoy these, she thought. "So you see, it is useful to sit and read a lot," she announced to the air. By this time, however, she knew she was trying to justify herself to the world, if not to Peter, because she had been rather too impressed with herself for getting a letter from the king. "Oh, well," she said. "Come on, Waif." Waif followed Charmaine into the house, but backed away from the kitchen door, trembling. Charmaine saw why when she came into the kitchen, and Peter looked up from his steaming saucepan. He had found an apron from somewhere and stacked all the crockery in neat heaps along the floor. He gave Charmaine a look of righteous pain. "Very ladylike," he said. "I ask you to help me wash up, and you pick flowers." "No, really," Charmaine said. "Those beastly kobolds have cut off all the pink ones." "They have?" Peter said. "That's too bad. Your uncle's going to be upset when he comes home, isn't he? You can put your flowers in that dish where the eggs are." Charmaine looked at the pie dish full of eggs crammed in beside the big bag of soap flakes among the teapots on the table. "Then where do we put the eggs?" "Just a moment." She went away to the bathroom and put the hydrangeas in the wash basin. It was rather ominously moist and trickly in there, but Charmaine preferred not to think about that. She went back to the kitchen and said, "Now, I'm going to nurture the hydrangea bushes by emptying these teapots on them." "Nice try," Peter said. "That'll take you several hours. Do you think this water is hot yet?" "Only steaming," Charmaine said. "I think it ought to bubble, and it won't take me hours. Watch." She sorted out 2 largish saucepans and began emptying teapots into them. She was saying, "There are some advantages to being lazy, you know," when she realized that as soon as she had emptied a teapot and put it back on the table, the teapot disappeared. "Leave us one," Peter said anxiously. "I'd like a hot drink." Charmaine thought about this and carefully put the last teapot down on the chair. It disappeared too. "Oh, well," Peter said. Since he was obviously trying not to be so unfriendly, Charmaine said, "We can get afternoon tea in the living room after I've emptied these, And my mother brought another bag of food when she came." Peter cheered up remarkably. "Then we can have a decent meal when we've done the washing up," he said. "We're doing that first, whatever you say." And he held Charmaine to it, in spite of her protests. As soon as she came in from the garden, Peter came and took the book out of her hands and presented her with a cloth to tie round her waist instead. Then he led her to the kitchen, where the mysterious and horrible process began. Peter thrust another cloth into her hands. "You wipe and I'll wash," he said, lifting the steaming saucepan off the fire and pouring half the hot water on the soap flakes sprinkled in the sink. He heaved up a bucket of cold water from the pump and poured half of that in the sink too. "Why are you doing that?" Charmaine asked. "So as not to get scolded," Peter replied, plunging knives and forks into his mixture and following those with a stack of plates. "Don't you know anything?" "No," Charmaine said. She thought irritably that not one of the many books she had read had so much as mentioned washing dishes, let alone explained how you did it. She watched as Peter briskly used a dishcloth to wipe old dinner off a patterned plate. The plate came out of the suds bright and clean. Charmaine rather liked the pattern now, and was almost inclined to believe that this was magic. She watched Peter dip the plate in another bucket to rinse it. Then he handed it to her. "What do I do with this?" she asked. "Wipe it dry, of course," he said. "Then stack it on the table." Charmaine tried. The whole horrible business took ages. The wiping cloth hardly seemed to soak up water at all, and the plate kept nearly slithering out of her hands. She was so much slower at wiping than Peter was at washing, that Peter soon had a heap of plates draining beside the sink, and began to get impatient. Naturally, at that point, the prettiest patterned plate slid out of Charmaine's hands completely and fell on the floor. Unlike the strange teapots, it broke. "Oh," Charmaine said, staring down at the pieces. "How do you put them together?" Peter rolled his eyes up toward the ceiling. "You don't," he said. "You just take care not to drop another." He collected the pieces of plate and threw them into another bucket. "I'll wipe now. You try your hand at washing, or we'll be all day." He let the now brownish water out of the sink, collected the knives, forks, and spoons out of it, and dropped them in the rinsing bucket. To Charmaine's surprise, they all seemed to be clean and shiny now. As she watched Peter fill the sink again with more soap and hot water, she decided, crossly but quite reasonably, that Peter had chosen the easy part of the work. She found she was mistaken. She did not find it easy at all. It took her slow ages on each piece of crockery, and she got soaked down the front of her in the process. And Peter kept handing back to her plates and cups, saucers and mugs, and saying they were still dirty. Nor would he let her wash any of the many dog dishes until the human crockery was done. Charmaine thought this was too bad of him. Waif had licked each one so clean that Charmaine knew they would be easier to wash than anything else. Then on top of this, she was horrified to find that her hands were coming out of the suds all red and covered with strange wrinkles. "I must be ill," she said. "I've got a horrible skin disease." She was annoyed and offended when Peter laughed at her. But the dreadful business was done at last. Charmaine, damp in front and wrinkly in the hands, went sulkily off to the living room to read the 12-branched wand by the slanting light of the setting sun, leaving Peter to stack the clean things in the pantry. By this time, she was feeling she might go mad if she didn't sit and read for a while. "I've hardly read a word all day," she thought. Peter interrupted her much too soon by coming in with a vase he had found and filled with the hydrangeas, which he dumped down on the table in front of her. "Where's that food you said your mother brought?" he said. "What?" Charmaine said, peering at him through the foliage. "I said food," Peter told her. Waif seconded him by leaning against Charmaine's legs and groaning. "Oh," Charmaine said. "Yes, food. You can have some if you promise not to dirty a single dish eating it." "That's all right," Peter said. "I'm so hungry I could lick it off the carpet." So Charmaine reluctantly stopped reading and dragged the bag of food out from behind the armchair, and they all three ate large numbers of Mr. Baker's beautiful pasties, followed by afternoon tea twice from the trolley. In the course of this huge meal, Charmaine parked the vase of hydrangeas on the trolley to be out of the way. When she next looked, they had vanished. "I wonder where they went," Peter said. "You can sit on the trolley and find out," Charmaine suggested. But Peter did not feel like going that far, to Charmaine's disappointment. While she ate, she tried to think of ways of persuading Peter to go away, back to Montalbino. It was not that she utterly disliked him exactly. It was just annoying to share the house with him, and she knew, as clearly as if Peter had told her, that the next thing he was going to make her do was to empty the things out of those laundry bags and wash them too. The idea of more washing made her shudder. "At least," she thought, "I'm not going to be here tomorrow, so he can't make me do it then." All at once she was hideously nervous. She was going to see the king. She had been crazy to write to him, quite mad, and now she was going to have to go and see him. Her appetite went away. She looked up from her last creamy scone and found it was now dark outside. The magical lighting had come on indoors, filling the room with what seemed like golden sunshine, but the windows were black. "I'm going to bed," she said. "I've got a long day tomorrow." "If that king of yours has any sense," Peter said, "he'll kick you straight out as soon as he sees you. Then you can come back here and do the laundry." Since both these things were exactly what Charmaine was afraid of, she did not answer. She simply picked up Memoirs of an Exorcist for some light reading, marched to the door with it, and turned left to where the bedrooms were. Chapter 7, in which a number of people arrive at the royal mansion. Charmaine had rather a disturbed night. Some of this was certainly due to Memoirs of an Exorcist, whose author had clearly been very busy among a lot of haunts and weirdities, all of which he described in a matter-of-fact way that left Charmaine in no doubt that ghosts were entirely real and mostly very unpleasant. She spent a lot of the night shivering and wishing she knew how to turn on the light. Some of the disturbance was due to Waif, who was determined she had a right to sleep on Charmaine's pillow. But most of the disturbance was nerves, pure and simple, and the fact that Charmaine had no way of telling what the time was. She kept waking up, thinking, "Suppose I oversleep?" She woke in grey dawn, hearing birds twittering somewhere, and almost decided to get up then. But somehow she fell asleep again, and when she woke next, it was in broad daylight. "Help!" she cried out, and flung back the covers, accidentally flinging Waif onto the floor too, and stumbled across the room to find the good clothes she had put out specially. As she dragged on her best green skirt, the sensible thing to do came to her at last. "Great-Uncle William," she called out, "how do I tell what time it is?" "Merely tap your left wrist," the kindly voice replied, "and say, 'Time, my dear.'" It struck Charmaine that the voice was fainter and weaker than it had been. She hoped it was simply that the spell was wearing off, and not that Great-Uncle William was getting weaker himself, wherever he was. "Time," she said, tapping. She expected a voice, or more probably a clock to appear. People in High Norland were great on clocks. Her own house had 17, including one in the bathroom. She had been vaguely surprised that Great-Uncle William did not seem to have even one cuckoo clock somewhere, but she realized the reason for this when what happened was that she simply knew the time. It was 8 o'clock. "And it'll take me at least an hour to walk there," she gasped, ramming her arms into her best silk blouse as she ran for the bathroom. She was more nervous than ever as she did her hair in there. Her reflection, with water trickling across it for some reason, looked terribly young with its hair in one rusty pigtail over its shoulder. "He'll know I'm only a schoolgirl," she thought. But there was no time to dwell on it. Charmaine rushed out of the bathroom and back through the same door leftward and charged into the warm, tidy kitchen. There were now 5 laundry bags leaning beside the sink, but Charmaine had no time to bother about that. Waif scuttled toward her, whining piteously, and scuttled back to the fireplace, where the fire was still cheerfully burning. Charmaine was just about to tap the mantelpiece and ask for breakfast when she saw Waif's problem. Waif was now too small to get her tail anywhere near the fireplace. So Charmaine tapped and said, "Dog food, please," before asking for breakfast for herself. As she sat at the cleared table, hurrying through her breakfast, while Waif briskly cleaned up the dog dish at her feet, Charmaine could not help grudgingly thinking that it was much nicer having the kitchen clean and tidy. "I suppose Peter has his uses," she thought, pouring herself a last cup of coffee. But then she felt she ought to tap her wrist again, and she knew it was now 6 minutes to 9 and jumped up in a panic. "How did I take so long?" she said out loud, and raced back to her bedroom for her smart jacket. Perhaps because she was putting on the jacket as she ran, she somehow turned the wrong way through the door and found herself in a very peculiar place. It was a long, thin room, with pipes running everywhere around it, and in the middle, a large, trickling tank, mystifyingly covered in blue fur. "Oh, bother!" Charmaine said, and backed out through the door. She found herself back in the kitchen. "At least I know the way from here," she said, diving through into the living room and running for the front door. Outside, she nearly tripped over a crock of milk, which must have been meant for Rollo. "And he doesn't deserve it," she said as she shut the front door with a slam. Down the front path she raced, between beheaded hydrangeas, and out through the gate, which shut with a clash behind her. Then she managed to slow down because it was silly to try to run however many miles it was to the royal mansion. But she went down the road at a very brisk walk indeed, and she had just got to the first bend when the garden gate went clash again behind her. Charmaine whirled round. Waif was running after her, pattering as fast as her little legs would take her. Charmaine sighed and marched back towards her. Seeing her coming, Waif gambolled delightedly and made tiny squeaks of pleasure. "No, Waif," Charmaine said, "you can't. Come, go home." She pointed sternly toward Great-Uncle William's house. "Home!" Waif drooped both ears and sat up and begged. "No!" Charmaine commanded, pointing again. "Go home!" Waif dropped to the ground and became a miserable white lump, with just the tip of her tail wagging. "Oh, honestly," Charmaine said. And since Waif seemed determined not to budge from the middle of the road, Charmaine was forced to pick her up and rush back to Great-Uncle William's house with her. "I can't take you with me," she explained breathlessly as they went. "I've got to see the king, and people just don't take dogs to see the king." She opened Great-Uncle William's front gate and dumped Waif on the garden path. "There, now, stay!" She shut the gate on Waif's reproachful face and strode off down the road again. As she went, she tapped her wrist anxiously and said, "Time?" But she was outside Great-Uncle William's grounds then, and the spell did not work. All Charmaine knew was that it was getting later. She broke into a trot. Behind her the gate clashed again. Charmaine looked back to see Waif once more racing after her. Charmaine groaned, whirled round, raced to meet Waif, scooped her up, and dumped her back inside the gate. "Now be a good dog and stay," she panted, rushing off again. The gate clashed behind her, and Waif once more came pelting after her. "I shall scream," Charmaine said. She turned back and dumped Waif inside the gate for the third time. "Stay there, you silly little dog." This time she set off toward town at a run. Behind her the gate clashed yet again. Tiny footsteps pattered in the road. Charmaine whirled round and ran back toward Waif, crying out, "Oh, blast you, Waif! I shall be so late." This time she picked Waif up and carried her toward the town, panting out, "All right, you win. I shall have to take you, because I'll be late if I don't. But I don't want you, Waif. Don't you understand?" Waif was delighted. She squirmed upward and licked Charmaine's chin. "No, stop that," Charmaine said. "I'm not pleased. I hate you. You're a real nuisance. Keep still, or I'll drop you." Waif settled into Charmaine's arms with a sigh of contentment. "Grrr," Charmaine said as she hurried on. As she rounded the huge bulge of cliff, Charmaine had meant to check upward in case the lubbock came plunging down at her from the meadow above. But by then she was in such a hurry that she clean forgot about the lubbock and simply jog-trotted onward. And greatly to her surprise, the town was almost in front of her when she came round the bend. She had not remembered it was so near. There were the houses and towers, rosy and twinkling in the morning sun, only a stone's throw away. "I think Aunt Sempronia's pony made a meal of this journey," Charmaine thought, as she strode in among the first houses. The road dived in across the river and became a dirty town street. Charmaine thought she remembered that this end of town was rather rough and unpleasant, and marched on fast and nervously. But although most of the people she passed seemed quite poor, none of them seemed to notice Charmaine particularly, or if they did, they only noticed Waif, peeping out enthusiastically from Charmaine's arms. "Pretty little dog," remarked a woman, carrying strings of onions to market as Charmaine strode by. "Pretty little monster," Charmaine said. The woman looked very surprised. Waif squirmed protestingly. "Yes, you are," Charmaine told her, as they began to come among wider streets and smarter houses. "You're a bully and a blackmailer, and if you've made me late I shall never forgive you." As they reached the marketplace, the big clock on the town hall struck 10 o'clock, and Charmaine went suddenly from needing to hurry to wondering how she was going to stretch 10 minutes' walk into half an hour. The royal mansion was practically just round the corner from here. At least she could slow down and get cool. By now the sun had burned through the mist from the mountains, and what with that and Waif's warm body, Charmaine was decidedly hot. She took a detour along the esplanade that ran high above the river, rushing swift and brown on its way to the great valley beyond the town, and dropped to a saunter. 3 of her favourite bookshops were on this road. She pushed her way among other sauntering people and looked eagerly into windows. "Nice little dog," several people said as she went. "Huh," Charmaine said to Waif. "Fat lot they know." She arrived in Royal Square as the big clock there began to chime the half-hour. Charmaine was pleased, but as she crossed the square to the booming of the clock, she was somehow not pleased and not hot any more either. She was cold and small and insignificant. She knew she had been stupid to come. She was a fool. They would take one look at her and send her away. The flashing of the golden tiles on the roof of the royal mansion daunted her completely. She was glad of Waif's small warm tongue licking her chin again. By the time she was climbing the steps to the heavy front door of the mansion, she was so nervous that she almost turned round and ran away. But she told herself firmly that this was the one thing in the world she really wanted to do. "Even though I'm not sure I do want to now," she thought, And everyone knows that those tiles are only tin, enchanted to look like gold," she added, and she lifted the great gold-painted knocker and bravely hammered on the door with it. Then her knees threatened to fold under her, and she wondered if she could run away. She stood there quivering and clutching Waif hard. The door was opened by an old serving man. Probably the butler, Charmaine thought, wondering where she had seen the old man before. "I must have passed him in town, on my way to school," she thought. She said, "I'm Charmaine Baker. The king wrote me a letter." She let go of Waif with one hand in order to fetch the letter out of her pocket, but before she could get at it, the old butler held the door wide open. "Please to come in, Miss Charming," he said in a quavery old voice. "His Majesty is expecting you." Charmaine found herself entering the royal mansion on legs that wobbled almost as badly as the old butler's did. He was so stooped with age that his face was on a level with Waif as Charmaine wobbled in past him. He stopped her with a shaky old hand. "Please to keep tight hold on the little dog, miss. It wouldn't do to have it wandering about here." Charmaine discovered herself to be babbling. "I do hope it's all right to bring her. She would keep following me, you see, and in the end I had to pick her up and carry her, or I'd have been—" "Perfectly all right, miss," the butler said, heaving the great door shut. "His Majesty is very fond of dogs. Indeed, he has been bitten several times trying to make friends with— Well, the fact of the matter is, miss, that our Rajputee cook owns a dog that is not at all a nice creature. It has been known to slay other dogs when they impinge upon its territory." "Oh, dear," Charmaine said weakly. "Precisely," said the old butler. "If you will follow me, miss." Waif squirmed in Charmaine's arms because Charmaine was clutching her so tightly as she followed the butler along a broad stone corridor. It was cold inside the mansion, and rather dark. Charmaine was surprised to find that there were no ornaments anywhere, and almost no hint of royal grandeur, unless you counted one or two large brown pictures in dingy gold frames. There were big pale squares on the walls every so often, where pictures had been taken away, but Charmaine was by now so nervous that she did not wonder about this. She just became colder and thinner and more unimportant, until she felt she must be about the size of Waif. The butler stopped and creakily pushed open a mighty square oak door. "Your Majesty, Miss Charming Baker," he announced, "and dog." Then he doddered away. Charmaine managed to dodder into the room. The shakiness must be catching, she thought, and did not dare curtsy in case her knees collapsed. The room was a vast library. Dim brown shelves of books stretched away in both directions. The smell of old book, which Charmaine normally loved, was almost overpowering. Straight in front of her was a great oak table, piled high with more books and stacks of old yellow papers, and some newer, whiter paper at the near end. There were 3 big carved chairs at that end, arranged around a very small charcoal fire in an iron basket. The basket sat on a kind of iron tray, which in turn sat on an almost worn-out carpet. 2 old people sat in 2 of the carved chairs. One was a big old man with a nicely trimmed white beard and, when Charmaine dared to look at him, kindly crinkled old blue eyes. She knew he had to be the king. "Come here, my dear," he said to her,
and take a seat. Put the little dog down near the fire."
Charmaine managed to do as the king said. Waif, to her relief, seemed to realize that one must be on one's best behaviour here. She sat gravely down on the carpet and politely quivered her tail. Charmaine sat on the edge of the carved chair and quivered all over.
"Let me make my daughter known to you," said the king. "Princess Hilda."
Princess Hilda was old too. If Charmaine had not known she was the king's daughter, she might have thought the princess and the king were the same age. The main difference between them was that the princess looked twice as royal as the king. She was a big lady like her father, with very neat iron-grey hair and a tweed suit so plain and tweed-coloured that Charmaine knew it was a highly aristocratic suit. Her only ornament was a big ring on one veiny old hand. "That is a very sweet little dog," she said, in a firm and forthright voice. "What is her name?"
"Waif, your highness,"
Charmaine faltered. "And have you had her long?" the princess asked. Charmaine could tell that the princess was making conversation in order to set her at her ease, and that made her more nervous than ever.
"No, that is," she said, "the fact is, she was a stray, or Great-Uncle William said she was, and he can't have had her long because he didn't know she was a girl. William Norland, you know, the wizard."
The king and the princess both said, "Oh," at this, and the king said,
"Are you related to Wizard Norland, then, my dear?"
"Our great friend," added the princess.
He's my Aunt Sempronia's great-uncle, really,"
Charmaine confessed. Somehow the atmosphere became much more friendly. The king said rather longingly,
"I suppose you've had no news of how Wizard Norland is yet?"
Charmaine shook her head. "I'm afraid not, Your Majesty, but he did look awfully ill when the elves took him away."
"Not to be wondered at," stated Princess Hilda. "Poor William. Now, Miss Baker."
Oh, please, call me Charmaine," Charmaine stammered.
"Very well," the princess agreed. "But we must get down to business now, child, because I shall have to leave you soon to attend to my first guest." "My daughter is sparing you an hour or so," the king said, "to explain to you what we do here in the library and how you may best assist us. This is because we gathered from your handwriting that you are not very old, which we see is the case, and so probably inexperienced."
He gave Charmaine the most enchanting smile.
"We really are most grateful to you for your offer of help, my dear. No one has ever considered that we might need assistance before."
Charmaine felt her face filling with heat. She knew she was blushing horribly.
"My pleasure,
she managed to mutter.
"Pull your chair over to the table," Princess Hilda interrupted, "and we'll get down to work."
As Charmaine got up and dragged the heavy chair over, the king said courteously,
"We hope you may not be too hot in here with the brazier beside you. It may be summer now, but we old people feel the cold these days."
Charmaine was still frozen with nerves. "Not at all, sire," she said.
"And Waif at least is happy," the king said, pointing a gnarly finger.
Waif had rolled over onto her back with all four paws in the air and was basking in the heat from the brazier. She seemed far happier than Charmaine was.
"To work, father,"
the princess said severely. She fetched up the glasses hanging from a chain round her neck and planted them on her aristocratic nose. The king fetched up a pair of pince-nez. Charmaine fetched up her own glasses. If she had not been so nervous, she would have wanted to giggle at the way they all had to do this. "Now," said the princess, "we have in this library books, papers, and parchment scrolls.
After a lifetime of labour, Father and I have managed to list roughly half the books by name and author's name, and assigned each a number, together with a brief account of what is in each book. Father will continue doing this, while you make yourself responsible for my main task, which is to catalogue papers and scrolls. I have barely made a start there, I'm afraid. Here is my list." She opened a large folder full of sheets of paper covered in elegant spidery writing, and spread a row of them in front of Charmaine. "As you see, I have several main headings: family letters, household accounts, historic writings, and so on. Your task is to go through each pile of paper and decide exactly what every sheet contains. You then write a description of it under the appropriate heading, after which you put the paper carefully in one of these labelled boxes here. Is this clear so far?" Charmaine, leaning forward to look at the beautifully written lists, was afraid that she seemed awfully stupid. "What do I do," she asked, "if I find a paper that doesn't fit any of your headings, Mom?" "A very good question," Princess Hilda said. "We are hoping that you will find a great many things that do not fit. When you do find one, consult my father at once, in case the paper is important. If it isn't, put it in the box marked Miscellaneous. Now, here is your first packet of papers. I'll watch as you go through them to see how you go on. There is paper for your lists. Pen and ink are here. Please start." She pushed a frayed brown packet of letters, tied together with pink tape, in front of Charmaine and sat back to watch. "I've never known anything so off-putting," Charmaine thought. She tremulously unpicked the pink knot and tried spreading the letters out a little. "Pick each one up by its opposite corners," Princess Hilda said. "Don't push them." "Oh dear," Charmaine thought. She glanced sideways at the king, who had taken up a wilted-looking soft leather book and was leafing carefully through it. "I'd hoped to be doing that," she thought. She sighed and carefully opened the first crumbly brown letter. "My dearest, gorgeous, wonderful darling," she read. "I miss you so hideously." She said to Princess Hilda. "Is there a special box for love letters?" "Yes, indeed," said the princess. "This one. Record the date and the name of the person who wrote it. Who was it, by the way?" Charmaine looked on to the end of the letter. It says, Big Dolphy." Both the king and the princess said, "Well," and laughed, the king most heartily. "Then they are from my father to my mother," Princess Hilda said. "My mother died many years ago now, but never mind that. Write it on your list." Charmaine looked at the crumbly brown state of the paper and thought it must have been many years ago. She was surprised that the king did not seem to mind her reading it, but neither he nor the princess seemed in the least worried. Perhaps royal people are different, she thought, looking at the next letter. It began, "Dearest Chuffy Puffy one." Oh, well, she got on with her task. After a while the princess stood up and pushed her chair neatly up to the table. "This seems quite satisfactory," she stated. "I must go. My guest will be arriving soon. I still wish I had been able to ask that husband of hers too, Father." "Out of the question, my dear," the king said, without looking up from the notes he was making. "Poaching. He's someone else's royal wizard." "Oh, I know," Princess Hilda said, "but I am also aware that Ingery has 2 royal wizards, and our poor William is ill, and may be dying." "Life is never fair, my dear," the king said, still scratching away with his quill pen. "Besides, William had no more success than we have had." "I'm aware of that too, Father," Princess Hilda said as she left the library. The door shut with a heavy thud behind her. Charmaine bent over her next pile of papers,
trying to look as if she had not been listening. It seemed private. This pile of paper had been tied into a bundle for so long that each sheet had stuck to the next one, all dry and brownish, like a wasp's nest Charmaine had once found in the attic at home. She became very busy trying to separate the layers. "Ahem," said the king. Charmaine looked up to see that he was smiling at her, with his quill in the air and a sideways twinkle at her from above his glasses.
"I see you are a very discreet young lady," he said, "and you must have gathered from our talk just now that we, and your great-uncle with us, are searching for some very important things. My daughter's headings will give you some clue what to look out for. Your key words will be treasury, revenues, gold, and elf gift. If you find a mention of any of these, my dear, please tell me at once."
The idea of looking for such important things made Charmaine's fingers on the frail paper go all cold and clumsy. Yes, of course, Your Majesty," she said. Rather to her relief, that packet of papers was nothing but lists of goods and their prices, all of which seemed surprisingly low. "To 10 pounds of wax candles at 2 pennies a pound, 20 pence, she read. Well, it did seem to date from 200 years ago. "To 6 ounces of finest saffron, 30 pence. To 9 logs of fragrant apple wood for the scenting of the chief chambers, 1 farthing, and so on. The next page was full of things like, "To 40 ells of linen drapes, 44 shillings. Charmaine made careful notes, put those pages in the box labelled Household Accounts, and peeled up the next sheet. "Oh," she said. The next sheet said, "To Wizard Melicott, for the enchanting of 100 square feet of tin tilings, to give the appearance of a golden roof, 200 guineas.
"What is it, my dear?"
the king asked, putting his finger on his place in his book. Charmaine read the ancient bill out to him. He chuckled and shook his head a little.
"So it was definitely done by magic, was it?" he said. "I must confess I had always hoped it would turn out to be real gold, hadn't you?"
"Yes, but it looks like gold anyway," Charmaine said consolingly.
"And a very good spell, too, to last 200 years, the king said, nodding. "Expensive as well. 200 guineas was a lot of money in those days. Ah, well, I never did hope to solve our financial problems that way. Besides, it would look shocking if we climbed up and stripped all the tiles off the roof. Keep looking, my dear."
Charmaine kept looking, but all she found was someone charging 2 guineas to plant a rose garden, and someone else getting paid 10 guineas to refurbish the treasury. No, not someone else. The same Wizard Melicott who did the roof.
"Melicott was a specialist, I fancy," the king said, when Charmaine had read this out. "Looks to me like a fellow who went in for faking precious metals. The treasury was certainly empty by that date. I've known my crown was a fake for years. Must be this Melicott's work. Are you getting peckish at all, my dear? A bit cold and stiff? We don't bother with regular lunch. My daughter doesn't hold with it. But I generally ask the butler to bring in a snack around this time. Why not get up and stretch your legs while I ring the bell?"
Charmaine stood up and walked about, causing Waif to roll to her feet and watch inquiringly, while the king limped over to the bell rope by the door. He was decidedly frail, Charmaine thought, and very tall. It was as if his height was too much for him. While they waited for someone to answer the bell, Charmaine seized the chance to look at the books in the shelves. They seemed to be books about everything, higgledy-piggledy, travel books next to books of algebra, and poems rubbing shoulders with geography. Charmaine had just opened one called Secrets of the Universe Revealed, when the library door opened, and a man in a tall cook's hat came in carrying a tray. To Charmaine's surprise, the king nimbly skipped behind the table.
"My dear, pick up your dog," he called out urgently.
Another dog had come in, pressed close to the cook's legs as if it felt unsafe. A bitter-looking brown dog, with gnarly ears and a ratty tail. It was growling as it came. Charmaine had no doubt that this was the dog that slew other dogs, and she dived to pick Waif up. But Waif somehow slipped through her hands and went trotting toward the cook's dog. The other dog's growls increased to a snarl. Bristles rose along its haggard brown back. It looked so menacing that Charmaine did not dare go any nearer to it. Waif, however, seemed to feel no fear. She went right up to the snarling dog in her jauntiest way, raised herself on her tiny hind legs, and cheekily dabbed her nose on its nose. The other dog started back, so surprised that it stopped snarling. Then it pricked its lumpy ears, and very cautiously nosed Waif in return. Waif gave an excited squeak and frisked. Next second, both dogs were gambolling delightedly all over the library.
"Well," said the king, "I suppose that's all right, then. What is the meaning of this, Jamal? Why are you here instead of Sim?"
Jamal, who had only one eye, Charmaine noticed, came and apologetically put his tray down on the table.
"Our princess has taken Sim away to receive the guest, sire," he explained, "leaving no one but me to bring food, and my dog would come, I think," he added, watching the two prancing dogs, "that my dog has never enjoyed life until now."
He bowed to Charmaine.
"Please bring your small white dog here again often, Miss Charming."
He whistled to his dog. It pretended not to hear. He went to the door and whistled again.
"Food," he said. "Come for Squid."
This time both dogs came, and to Charmaine's surprise and dismay, Waif went trotting out of the door beside the cook's dog, and the door shut after them both.
"Not to worry," the king said. "They seem to be friends. Jamal will bring her back. Very reliable fellow, Jamal. If it wasn't for that dog of his, he'd be the perfect cook. Let's see what he's brought us, shall we?"
Jamal had brought a jug of lemonade and a platter piled with crisp brown things under a white cloth. The king said,
"Ah,"
as he eagerly lifted the cloth.
"Have one while they're hot, my dear."
Charmaine did so. One bite was enough to assure her that Jamal was an even better cook than her father, and Mr. Baker was renowned for being the best cook in town. The brown things were crunchy, but soft at the same time, with a rather hot taste that Charmaine had never met before. They made you need the lemonade. She and the king polished off the whole platterful between them and drank all the lemonade. Then they got back to work. By this time, they were on extremely friendly terms. Charmaine now had no shyness about asking the king anything she wanted to know. "Why would they need 2 bushels of rose petals, sire?" she asked him, and the king answered,
"They liked them underfoot in the dining saloon in those days. Messy habit, to my mind. Listen to what this philosopher has to say about camels, my dear."
And he read out a page from his book that made them both laugh. The philosopher had clearly not got on with camels. Quite a long time later, the library door opened and Waif trotted in, looking very pleased with herself. She was followed by Jamal.
"Message from our princess, sire," he said. "The lady has settled in, and Sim is taking tea to the front parlour." "Ah," said the king. "Crumpets?" "Muffins, too," Jamal said, and went away. The king banged his book shut and stood up. "I had better go and greet our guest," he said.
"I'll go on with the bills, then," Charmaine said. "I'll make a pile of the ones I want to ask about."
"No, no," said the king. "You come too, my dear. Bring the little dog. Helps break the ice, you know. This lady is my daughter's friend. Never met her myself."
Charmaine at once felt highly nervous again. She had found Princess Hilda thoroughly intimidating and much too royal for comfort, and any friend of hers was likely to be just as bad. But she could hardly refuse, when the king was expectantly holding the door open for her. Waif was already trotting after him. Charmaine felt forced to get up and follow. The front parlour was a large room full of faded sofas with slightly frayed arms and rather ragged fringes. There were more pale squares on the walls, where pictures must once have hung. The biggest pale square was over the grand marble fireplace, where, to Charmaine's relief, a cheerful fire was burning. The parlour, like the library, was a cold room, and Charmaine had gone cold with nerves again. Princess Hilda was sitting bolt upright on a sofa beside the fireplace, where Sim had just pushed a large tea-trolley. As soon as she saw Sim pushing a trolley, Charmaine knew where she had seen Sim before. It was when she'd got lost beside the conference room and had that glimpse of the old man pushing a trolley along a strange corridor. That's odd, she thought. Sim was in the act of shakily placing a plate of buttered crumpets in the hearth. At the sight of those crumpets, Waif's nose quivered, and she made a dash toward them. Charmaine was only just in time to catch her. As she stood up, holding the wriggling Waif firmly in both arms, the princess said, "Ah, my father, the king." Everyone else in the parlour stood up. "Father," said the princess, "may I introduce my great friend, Mrs. Sophie Pendragon?" The king strode limpingly forward, holding out his hand and making the large room look quite a little smaller. Charmaine had not realized before quite how large he was. Quite as tall as those elves, she thought. "Mrs. Pendragon," he said, "delighted to meet you. Any friend of our daughter's is a friend of ours." Mrs. Pendragon surprised Charmaine. She was quite young, younger than the princess by a long way, and modishly dressed in a peacock blue that set off her red-gold hair and blue-green eyes to perfection. "She's lovely," Charmaine thought, rather enviously. Mrs. Pendragon dropped the king a little curtsy as they shook hands and said, "I'm here to do my best, sire. More I can't say." "Quite right, the king replied. "Please be seated again, everyone, and let's have some tea." Everyone sat down, and a polite, courteous hum of conversation began, while Sim doddered around giving out cups of tea. Charmaine felt a complete outsider. Feeling sure that she should not be here, she sat herself in the corner of the most distant sofa and tried to work out who the other people were. Waif, meanwhile, sat sedately on the sofa beside Charmaine, looking demure. Her eyes keenly followed the gentleman who was handing round the crumpets. This gentleman was so quiet and colourless that Charmaine forgot what he looked like as soon as she took her eyes off him, and had to look at him again to remind herself. The other gentleman, the one whose mouth looked closed even when he was talking, she gathered was the king's chancellor. He seemed to have a lot of secretive things to say to Mrs. Pendragon, who kept nodding, and then blinking a bit, as if what the chancellor said surprised her. The other lady, who was elderly, seemed to be Princess Hilda's lady-in-waiting, and very good at talking about the weather. "And I shouldn't be surprised if it didn't rain again tonight," she was saying, as the colourless gentleman arrived beside Charmaine and offered her a crumpet. Waif's nose swivelled yearningly to follow the plate. "Oh, thanks," Charmaine said, pleased that he had not forgotten her. "Take two," suggested the colourless gentleman. "His Majesty will certainly eat any that are left over." The king at that moment was eating 2 muffins, one squashed on top of the other, and watching the crumpets as eagerly as Waif was. Charmaine thanked the gentleman again and took 2. They were the most buttery crumpets she had ever encountered. Waif's nose swivelled to dab gently against Charmaine's hand. All right, Charmaine muttered, trying to break off a piece without dripping butter on the sofa. Butter ran down her fingers and threatened to trickle up her sleeves. She was trying to get rid of it on her handkerchief when the lady-in-waiting finished saying all anyone could possibly say about the weather and turned to Mrs. Pendragon. "Princess Hilda tells me you have a charming little boy," she said. "Yes, Morgan," Mrs. Pendragon said. She seemed to be having trouble with butter too, and was mopping her fingers with her handkerchief and looking flustered. "How old will Morgan be now, Sophie?" Princess Hilda asked. "When I saw him, he was just a baby." "Oh, nearly 2, Mrs. Pendragon replied, catching a big golden drip of butter before it fell on her skirt. "I left him with—" The door of the parlour opened. Through it came a small fat toddler in a grubby blue suit, with tears rolling down his face. "Mama, Mama!" he was wailing as he staggered into the room. But as soon as he saw Mrs. Pendragon, his face spread into a blinding smile. He stretched out both arms and rushed to her, where he buried his face in her skirt. "Mum!" he shouted. Following him through the door came floating an agitated-looking blue creature, shaped like a long teardrop, with a face on the front of it. It seemed to be made of flames. It brought a gust of warmth with it, and a gasp from everyone in the room. An even more agitated housemaid hurried in after it. After the housemaid came a small boy, quite the most angelic child Charmaine had ever seen. He had a mass of blonde curls that clustered around his angelic pink and white face. His eyes were big and blue and bashful. His exquisite little chin rested on a frill of white lace, and the rest of his graceful little body was clothed in a pale blue velvet suit with big silver buttons. His pink rosebud mouth spread into a shy smile as he came in, showing a charming dimple in his delicate little cheek. Charmaine could not think why Mrs. Pendragon was staring at him in such horror. He was surely a truly enchanting child. And what long, curly eyelashes! "With my husband and his fire demon," Mrs. Pendragon finished. Her face had gone fiery red, and she glared at the little boy across the toddler's head. Chapter 8, in which Peter has trouble with the plumbing. "Oh, Mum, Sire," the housemaid gasped. "I had to let them in. The little one was so upset." She said this into a room full of confusion. Everyone stood up and someone dropped a teacup. Sim plunged to rescue the cup, and the king dived past him to pick up the plate of crumpets. Mrs. Pendragon stood up with Morgan in her arms, still looking daggers at the small boy, while the blue teardrop creature bobbed in front of her face. "It's not my fault, Sophie," it kept saying, in an agitated, crackling voice. "I swear it's not my fault. We couldn't stop Morgan crying for you." Princess Hilda rose quellingly to her feet. "You may go," she said to the housemaid. "There is no need for anyone to be upset. Sophie, dear, I had no idea that you didn't employ a nursemaid." "No, I don't, and I was hoping for a break," Mrs. Pendragon said. "You would think," she added, glowering at the angelic little boy, "that a wizard and a fire demon could manage one small toddler between them." "Men," said the princess. "I have no opinion of men's ability to manage anything. Of course, Morgan and the other little boy must be our guests too, now that they're here." "What sort of accommodation does a fire demon require?" she asked the colourless gentleman. He looked completely blank. "I'd appreciate a good log fire," the fire demon crackled. "I see I've a nice one in this room. That's all I need. I'm Calcifer, by the way, Ma'am." The princess and the colourless gentleman both looked relieved. The princess said, "Yes, of course. I believe we met briefly in Ingory 2 years ago." "And who is this other little fellow?" the king asked genially.
"Sophie's my auntie,"
the small boy answered in a sweet, lisping voice, raising his angelic face and big blue eyes to the king's. Mrs. Pendragon looked outraged.
"Pleased to meet you," the king said. "And what's your name, my little man?"
"Twinkle,"
the little boy whispered, coyly ducking his curly blonde head.
"Have a crumpet, Twinkle,"
the king said heartily, holding the plate out.
"Thank you,"
Twinkle said devoutly, taking a crumpet. At this, Morgan held out a fat, imperious hand and boomed, "Me, me, me," until the king gave him a crumpet too. Mrs. Pendragon sat Morgan on a sofa to eat it. Sim looked around and resourcefully fetched a cloth from the trolley. It became soaked in butter almost at once. Morgan beamed up at Sim, the princess, the lady-in-waiting, and the chancellor, with his face all shiny.
"Dump it,"
he said.
"Do dump it."
While this was going on, Charmaine became aware that Mrs. Pendragon had somehow trapped little Twinkle behind the sofa she was sitting on. She could not help but overhear Mrs. Pendragon demanding, "What do you think you're doing, Howl?" She sounded so fierce that Waif jumped into Charmaine's lap and cowered there.
"They forgot to invite me,"
Twinkle's sweet little voice replied.
"That's silly. You can't sort out this mess on your own, Sophie. You need me."
"No, I do not," Sophie retorted. "And do you have to lisp like that?"
"Yes,"
said Twinkle. "Duh," said Sophie. "It's not funny, Howl. And you've dragged Morgan here."
"I tell you,"
Twinkle interrupted her.
"Morgan did not stop crying from the moment you left. Ask Calcifer if you don't believe me."
"Calcifer's as bad as you are," Sophie said passionately. "I don't believe either of you so much as tried to stop him, did you? You were just looking for an excuse to launch this masquerade on poor Princess Hilda."
"She needs us, Sophie,"
Twinkle said earnestly. Charmaine was quite fascinated by this conversation, but, unfortunately, Morgan looked round for his mother just then, and spotted Waif trembling on Charmaine's knee. He gave a loud cry of "Doggy!" slid off his sofa, trampling the cloth as he went, and rushed at Waif with both buttery hands out. Waif jumped desperately onto the back of the sofa, where she stood and yapped like a shrill version of someone with a hacking cough. Charmaine was forced to pick Waif up and back away out of Morgan's reach, so that all she heard next of the strange conversation behind the sofa was Mrs. Pendragon saying something about sending Twinkle, or was his name Howl, to bed without supper, and Twinkle daring her to
"Just try it."
As Waif quieted down, Twinkle said wistfully,
"Don't you think I'm pretty at all?"
There was a strange hollow thump then, as if Mrs. Pendragon had so far forgotten good behaviour as to stamp her foot. "Yes," Charmaine heard her say, "disgustingly pretty." "Well," said Princess Hilda over near the fire, while Charmaine was still backing away from Morgan, "things are certainly lively with children around. Sim, give Morgan a muffin, quickly." Morgan at once reversed direction and ran towards Sim and the muffins. Charmaine heard her own hair frizzle. She looked round and found the fire demon hovering beside her shoulder, looking at her with flaming orange eyes.
"Who are you?"
the demon said. Charmaine's heart thumped a little, although Waif seemed perfectly calm. If I hadn't just met a lubbock, Charmaine thought, I'd be quite frightened of this Calcifer. I'm only the temporary help in the library, she said.
"Then we'll need to talk to you later," Calcifer crackled. "You reek of magic, did you know? You and your dog."
"She's not my dog. She belongs to a wizard," Charmaine said.
"This wizard Norland who seems to have messed things up?"
Calcifer asked. "I don't think Great Uncle William messed things up," Charmaine said. "He's a dear."
"He seems to have looked in all the wrong places," Calcifer said. "You don't need to be nasty to make a mess. Look at Morgan."
And he whisked away. He had this way, Charmaine thought, of vanishing in one place and turning up in another, like a dragonfly flicking about over a pond. The king came across to Charmaine, jovially wiping his hands on a large, crisp napkin.
Better get back to work, my dear. We have to tidy up for the night."
"Yes, of course, sire," Charmaine said, and followed him toward the door. Before they got there, the angelic Twinkle somehow escaped from the angry Mrs. Pendragon and pulled at the sleeve of the lady-in-waiting. "Please," he asked charmingly, "do you have any toys?" The lady looked nonplussed. "I don't play with toys, dear," she said. Morgan caught the word from her. "Toy!" he shouted, waving both arms with a buttery muffin clutched in one fist. "Toy, toy, toy!" A jack-in-the-box landed in front of Morgan, bursting its lid open, so that the jack popped out with a boing. A large dollhouse crashed down beside it, followed by a shower of elderly teddy bears. An instant later, a shabby rocking horse established itself next to the tea-trolley. Morgan shouted with delight.
"I think we'll leave my daughter to cope with her guests," the king said, ushering Charmaine and Waif out of the parlour. He shut the door upon more and more toys appearing, and the child Twinkle looking highly demure, while everyone else ran about in confusion. "Wizards are often very vigorous guests," the king remarked on his way back to the library, "although I had no idea they started so young. A bit trying for their mothers, I imagine."
Half an hour later, Charmaine was on her way back to Great Uncle William's house, with Waif pattering behind her, looking as demure as the child Twinkle. "Oof," Charmaine said to her. "You know, Waif, I've never lived so much life in 3 days. Ever." She felt a bit wistful all the same. It made sense for the king to give her the bills and love letters, but she did wish they could have taken turns with the books. She would have loved to spend some of the day at least going through a thoroughly elderly and musty leather-bound volume. It was what she had been hoping for. But never mind. As soon as she got back to Great Uncle William's house, she could bury herself in the 12-branched wand. Or perhaps Memoirs of an Exorcist would be better, since it seemed to be the kind of book you were happier to read by daylight. Or try a different book altogether, maybe. She was looking forward so much to a good read that she hardly noticed the walk, except to pick Waif up again when Waif began panting and toiling. With Waif in her arms, she kicked Great Uncle William's gate open and found herself confronting Rollo halfway up the path, scowling all over his small blue face. "What is it now?" Charmaine said to him, and seriously wondered whether to pick Rollo up too and throw him into the hydrangeas. Rollo was small enough to hurl beautifully, even when she had one arm wrapped round Waif.
"Them flower heads you got all over that outside table," Rollo said. "You expect me to stick them back on or something?"
"No, of course not," Charmaine said. "They're drying in the sun. Then I'll have them in the house."
"Huh," said Rollo. "Prettifying in there, are you? How do you think the wizard'll like that?"
"None of your business," Charmaine said haughtily, and strode forward so that Rollo was forced to hop out of her way. He shouted something after her as she was opening the front door, but she did not bother to listen. She knew it was rude. She slammed the door shut on his yells. Indoors, the smell of the living room was more than musty. It was like a stagnant pond. Charmaine put Waif on the floor and sniffed suspiciously. So did Waif. Long brown fingers of something were oozing under the door to the kitchen. Waif tiptoed up to them warily. Charmaine, equally warily, put out her toe and prodded the nearest brown trickle. It squished like a marsh. "Oh, what has Peter done now?" Charmaine exclaimed. She flung the door open. 2 inches of water rippled all over the kitchen floor. Charmaine could see it seeping darkly up the 6 bags of laundry beside the sink. "Ah!" she cried out, slammed the door shut, opened it again, and turned left. The corridor there was awash. Sunlight from the end window flared on the water in a way that suggested a strong current coming from the bathroom. Angrily, Charmaine splashed her way there. All I wanted to do was sit down and read a book, she thought, and I come home to a flood. As she reached the bathroom, with Waif paddling unhappily after her, its door opened, and Peter shot out of it, damp down his front and looking thoroughly harassed. He had no shoes on, and his trousers were rolled up to his knees. "Oh, good! You're back," he said, before Charmaine could speak. "There's this hole in one of the pipes in here. I've tried 6 different spells to stop it, but all they do is make it move about. I was just going to turn the water off at that woolly tank through there, or try to anyway, but perhaps you could do something instead." "Woolly tank?" Charmaine said. "Oh, you mean that thing covered in blue fur? What makes you think that will do any good? Everywhere's flooded." "It's the only thing I haven't tried," Peter snarled at her. "The water has to come from there somehow. You can hear it trickling. I thought I might find a stopcock." "Oh, you're useless," Charmaine snarled back. "Let me have a look." She pushed Peter aside and flounced into the bathroom, raising a sheet of water as she went. There was indeed a hole. One of the pipes between the wash-basin and the bath had a lengthwise slit in it, and water was spraying out of it in a merry fountain. Here and there along the pipe were grey, magical-looking blobs, which must have been Peter's 6 useless spells. "And this is all his fault," she snarled to herself. "He was the one who made the pipes red hot. Oh, honestly." She rushed at the spraying slit and angrily planted both hands on it. "Stop this!" she commanded. Water sprayed out round her hands and into her face. "Stop it at once!" All that happened was that the slit moved sideways from under her fingers for about 6 inches and sprayed water over her pigtail and her right shoulder. Charmaine scooped her hands along to cover it again. "Stop that! Stop it!" The slit moved off sideways again. "So that's how you want it, is it?" Charmaine said to it, and scooped some more. The slit moved off. She followed it with her hands. In a moment or so, she had it cornered above the bath, and the water spraying harmlessly into the bath and running away down the plug hole. She kept it there by leaning on the pipe with one hand while she thought what next to do. "I wonder Peter didn't think of this," she thought in a sort of mutter, instead of running about casting useless spells. "Great Uncle William," she called out, "how do I stop the bathroom pipe leaking?" There was no answer. This was obviously not something Great Uncle William thought Charmaine would need to know. "I don't think he knows much about plumbing," Peter said from the doorway. "There's nothing useful in the suitcase either. I had it all out to sea." "Oh, did you?" Charmaine said nastily. "Yes. Some of the stuff in there is really interesting," Peter said. "I'll show you if you—" "Be quiet and let me think," Charmaine snapped at him. Peter seemed to realize that Charmaine might not be in a very good mood. He stopped talking and waited, while Charmaine stood in the bath and leaned on the pipe thinking. You had to come at this leak 2 ways, so that it couldn't slide off again. First you fixed it in one place, and then you covered it up. But how? Quick, before my feet are quite soaked. "Peter," she said, "go and get me some dishcloths, at least 3. "Why?" said Peter. "You don't think—" "Now," said Charmaine. To her relief, Peter went crossly splashing off, muttering about bossy, bad-tempered cats. Charmaine pretended not to hear. Meanwhile, she dared not let go of the slit, and the slit kept spraying, and she was getting wetter every second. Oh, blast Peter! She put her other hand on the farther end of the slit and began pushing and sliding her hands together as hard as she could. "Close up," she ordered the pipe. "Stop leaking and close up." Water spouted rudely into her face. She could feel the slit trying to dodge, but she refused to let it. She pushed and pushed. "I can do magic," she thought at the pipe. "I worked a spell. I can make you close up. So close up." And it worked. By the time Peter came wading back with just 2 cloths,
saying those were all he could find. Charmaine was soaked through to her underclothes, but the pipe was whole again. Charmaine took the cloths and bound them around the pipe on either side of where the slit had been. Then she snatched up the long back brush from beside the bath, this being the only thing remotely like a wizard's staff that she could see, and batted at the cloths with it. "Stay there! Don't dare move!" she told the cloths. She batted at the mended slit. "You stay shut!" she told it, "or it'll be the worse for you." After that, she turned the back brush on Peter's blobby grey spells and batted at them too. "Go!" she told them. "Go away! You're useless!" And they all obediently vanished. Charmaine, flushed with a sense of great power, batted at the hot tap beside her knees. "Run hot again," she told it, "and let's have no nonsense. And you," she added, reaching across to bat at the hot tap on the wash basin. "Both hot, but not too hot, or I'll give you grief. But you stay running cold," she instructed the cold taps, batting them. Finally, she came out of the bath with a great splash and batted at the water on the floor. "And you, go! Go on, dry up, drain away, go, or else—" Peter waded over to the wash basin, turned the hot tap on, and held his hand under it. "It's warm," he said. "You really did it. That's a relief. Thanks." "Huh," said Charmaine, soaked and cold and grumpy. "Now I'm going to change into dry clothes and read a book." Peter asked, rather pathetically, "Aren't you going to help mop up, then?" Charmaine did not see why she should, but her eye fell on poor Waif struggling toward her with water lapping at her underside. It did not look as if the back brush had worked on the floors. "All right," she sighed. "But I have done a day's work already, you know." "So have I," Peter said feelingly. "I was rushing about all day trying to stop that pipe leaking. Let's get the kitchen dry at least." As the fire was still leaping and crackling in the kitchen grate, it was not unlike a steam bath in there. Charmaine waded through the tepid water and opened the window. Apart from the mysteriously multiplying laundry bags, which were sodden everywhere but the floor was dry. This included the suitcase open on the table. Behind Charmaine, Peter spoke strange words, and Waif whimpered. Charmaine whirled round to find Peter with his arms stretched out. Little flames were flickering on them from his fingers to his shoulders. "Dry, O waters on the floor," he intoned. Flames began to flicker across his hair and down his damp front, too. His face changed from smug to alarmed. "Oh, dear," he said. As he said this, the flames rippled all over him, and he began to burn quite fiercely. By then he looked plain frightened. "It's hot! Help!" Charmaine rushed at him, seized one of his blazing arms and pushed him over into the water on the floor. This did no good at all. Charmaine stared at the extraordinary sight of flames flickering away under the water and simmering bubbles appearing all round Peter, where the water was starting to boil, and hauled him up again double-quick in a shower of hot water and steam. "Cancel it!" she shouted, snatching her hands off his hot sleeve. "What spell did you use?" "I don't know how," Peter wailed. "What spell?" Charmaine bawled at him. "It was the spell to stop floods in the Boke of Palimpsest," Peter babbled, "and I've no idea how to cancel it." "Oh, you are stupid!" Charmaine cried out. She grabbed him by one flaming shoulder and shook him. "Cancel! Spell!" she shouted. "Ouch! Spell! I order you to cancel at once." The spell obeyed her. Charmaine stood shaking her scorched hand and watched the flames vanish in a sizzle, a cloud of steam, and a wet, singeing smell. It left Peter looking brown and frizzled all over. His face and hands were bright pink, and his hair was noticeably shorter. "Thanks," he said, flopping over with relief. Charmaine pushed him upright. "Pooh, you smell of burned hair. How can you be so stupid? What other spells have you been doing?" "Nothing," Peter said, raking burned bits out of his hair. Charmaine was fairly sure he was lying, but if he was, Peter was not going to confess. "And it wasn't that stupid," he argued. "Look at the floor." Charmaine looked down to see that the water had mostly gone. The floor was once again simply tiles, wet, shiny, and steaming, but not flooded any longer. "Then you've been very lucky," she said. "I mostly am," Peter said. "My mother always says that too, whenever I do a spell that goes wrong. I think I'm going to have to change into different clothes." "Me too," Charmaine said. They went through the inner door, where Peter tried to turn right, and Charmaine pushed him left, so that they went straight and arrived in the living room. The wet trickles on the carpet there were steaming and drying out rapidly, but the room still smelled horrible. Charmaine snorted, turned Peter round, and pushed him left through the door again. Here the corridor was damp, but not full of water any longer. "See?" Peter said as he went into his bedroom. "It did work." "Huh!" Charmaine said, going into her own room. "I wonder what else he's done. I don't trust him an inch." Her best clothes were a wet mess. Charmaine took them off sadly and hung them around the room to get dry. And nothing was going to cure the big scorch mark down the front of her best jacket. She would have to wear ordinary clothes tomorrow when she went to the royal mansion. And do I dare leave Peter alone here? She wondered. I bet he'll spend the time experimenting with spells. I know I would. She shrugged a little as she realized she was no better than Peter, really. She had been quite unable to resist the spells in the Book of Palimpsest either. She was feeling much more kindly toward Peter when she came back to the kitchen, dry again except for her hair and wearing her oldest clothes and her slippers. "Find out how to ask for supper," Peter said as Charmaine put her wet shoes to dry in the hearth. "I'm starving." He was looking much more comfortable in the old blue suit that he had arrived in. "There's food in the bag Mother brought yesterday," Charmaine said, busy arranging the shoes in the best place. "No, there isn't," Peter said. "I ate it all for lunch." Charmaine stopped feeling kindly toward Peter. "Greedy pig," she said, banging on the fireplace for food for Waif. Waif, in spite of all the crumpets she had eaten in the royal mansion, was delighted to see the latest dog dish. "And so are you a greedy pig," Charmaine said, watching Waif gobble. "Where do you put it all?" "Great-Uncle William, how do we get supper?" The kindly voice was very faint now. "Just knock on the pantry door and say, 'Supper, my dear.'" Peter got to the pantry first. "Supper!" he bellowed, banging hard on the door. There was a knobby flopping sound from the table. Both of them whirled round to look. There, lying beside the open suitcase, were a small lamb chop, 2 onions, and a turnip. Charmaine and Peter stared at them. "All raw," Peter said, stunned. "And not enough, anyway," Charmaine said. "Do you know how to cook it?" "No," said Peter. "My mother does all the cooking in our house." "Oh," said Charmaine, "honestly." Chapter 9. How Great-Uncle William's house proved to have many ways. Peter and Charmaine naturally converged on the fireplace then. Waif scuttled out of the way as, one after another, they beat on the mantelpiece and cried out, "Breakfast!" But it seemed that this spell only worked properly in the morning. "I wouldn't even have minded kippers," Charmaine said miserably, surveying the 2 trays. They had rolls, honey, and orange juice on them, and nothing else. "I know how to boil eggs," Peter said. "Will Waif eat this lamb chop?" "She'll eat almost anything," Charmaine said. "She's as bad as we are. I don't think she'll eat a turnip, though. I wouldn't." They had a somewhat unsatisfactory supper. Peter's eggs were, well, solid. In order to take Charmaine's mind off them, Peter asked her about her time in the royal mansion. Charmaine told him, in order to take both their minds off the way hard-boiled eggs did not mix with honey. Peter was highly intrigued by the way the king seemed to be looking for gold, and even more intrigued by the arrival of Morgan and Twinkle. "And a fire demon," he said. "2 infants with magical powers and a fire demon. I bet the princess has her hands full. How long are they staying?" "I don't know. Nobody said," Charmaine said. "Then I bet you 2 afternoon teas and a morning coffee that the princess turns them out before the weekend," Peter said. "Have you finished eating? Then I want you to look through your great-uncle's suitcase." "But I want to read a book," Charmaine protested. "No, you don't," Peter said. "You can do that any time. This suitcase is full of stuff you need to know. I'll show you." He pushed the breakfast trays aside and pulled the suitcase in front of her. Charmaine sighed and put her glasses on. The suitcase was full to the brim with paper. Lying on top was a note in Great-Uncle William's beautiful but shaky writing. "For Charmaine," it said. "Key to the house." Under that was a large sheet of paper with a tangle of swirly lines drawn on it. The lines had labelled boxes drawn on them at intervals, and each line ended in an arrow at the edge of the page with the word "Unexplored" written beside it. "That's the short key you've got there," Peter said, as Charmaine picked this paper up. "The rest of the stuff in the suitcase is the proper map. It folds out. Look." He took hold of the next sheet of paper and pulled, and it came out with the next sheet joined to it, and then the next, folded back and forth to fit in the suitcase. It came out onto the table in a huge zigzag. Charmaine stared at it resentfully. Each piece had carefully drawn rooms and corridors on it, and neatly written notes beside each thing. The notes said things like, "Turn left twice here," and 2 steps right and 1 left here. The rooms had blocks of writing in them, some simple, like kitchen, and some eloquent, like the one that read, "My store of wizardly supplies, kept constantly replenished by an intake spell I am rather proud of. Please note that the ingredients on the left-hand wall are all highly dangerous and must be handled with great care." And some of the joined sheets seemed to be all criss-crossing corridors labelled, "To unexplored north section," "To Kobolds," "To main cistern," or "To ballroom. I doubt if we shall ever find a use for this." "I was quite right to leave this suitcase shut," Charmaine said. "It's the most confusing map I ever saw in my life. It can't all be this house." "It is. It's enormous," Peter said. "And if you look, you'll see that the way the map is folded is a clue to how you get to the different parts of it. See? Here's the living room on the top page, but if you go to the next page, you don't get his study or the bedrooms, because those are folded back, see? You get the kitchen instead, because that's folded the same way." Charmaine's head began to go round, and she closed her ears to Peter's enthusiastic explanations. She looked at the swirling lines on the piece of paper in her hand instead. It almost seemed easier. At least she could see kitchen right in the middle of it, and bedrooms, and swimming pool, and study. Swimming pool? Not really. Surely. An interesting swirl led off to the right, underneath these boxes, into a tangle containing a box labelled Conference Room. An arrow pointed off from this box labelled To Royal Mansion. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "You can get to the king's house from here." "Out to a mountain meadow that says stables, but I can't see how to get there from his workroom yet," Peter expounded, unfolding another zigzag. "And here's food store. It says stasis spells operate. I wonder how you take those off. But what interests me are the places like this one, where he's written storage space, just junk. Must investigate some day. Do you think he created all this bent space himself? Or did he find it already there when he moved in?"
"He found it," Charmaine said. "You can tell by these arrows that say unexplored that he doesn't know what's out there yet." "You may be right," Peter said judiciously. "He really only uses the middle bits, doesn't he? We can do him a favour by exploring more of it." "You can if you like," Charmaine said. "I'm going to read my book." She folded up the paper with the swirly lines on it and stowed it in her pocket. This could save her a journey in the morning. In the morning, Charmaine's good clothes were still damp. She had to leave them draped depressingly around her room and get into her next nicest, while she wondered if she could manage to leave Waif behind with Peter today. Perhaps not. Suppose Peter tried another spell and contrived to turn Waif inside out or something. Waif, of course, came trotting eagerly after Charmaine into the kitchen. Charmaine tapped the fireplace for dog food and then, a little doubtfully, for her own breakfast. It could be that she and Peter had thrown the spell out by demanding breakfast yesterday evening. But no. Today she got a full tray with a choice of tea or coffee and toast and a plate piled high with something made with fish and rice and a peach to follow. "I think the spell's apologizing," she thought. She didn't like the fish stuff much, so she gave most of it to Waif, who liked it the way she always liked food and smelled quite fishy as she trotted after Charmaine, when Charmaine unfolded her swirly paper, ready to go to the royal mansion. Looking at the swirls confused Charmaine. She found she had been even more confused by the chart in the suitcase. Bending the paper backward and forward to try and reproduce what was in the suitcase did not help at all. After several turns left and right, she found herself walking into a place that was large and well lighted by big windows overlooking the river. There was a fine view of the town across the river where, most frustratingly, she could see the golden roof of the royal mansion gleaming in the sunlight. "But I'm trying to get there, not here," she said, looking around. There were long wooden tables under the windows, loaded with strange implements, and more implements stacked in the middle of the room. The other walls were full of shelves piled with jars, tins, and odd-shaped glassware. Charmaine sniffed the smell of new wood here, which was overlaid by the same thunderstorm and spice smell she had noticed in Great-Uncle William's study. The smell of magic having been done, she thought. This must be his workroom. To judge by the way Waif was trotting cheerily about, Waif knew this place well. "Come on, Waif," Charmaine said, pausing to look at a piece of paper on top of the strange implements in the middle of the room. It said, "Please do not touch." "Let's go back to the kitchen and start again." It did not work out that way. A left turn from the workroom door brought them into a warm place open to the sky, where a small blue pool rippled amid white stone surrounds. The place was fenced off by white stone trellises, with roses growing up them, and there were white reclining chairs beside the roses piled with large fluffy towels. Ready for when you'd finished swimming, Charmaine supposed. But poor Waif was terrified of this place. She crouched against the gateway, whining and trembling. Charmaine picked her up. "Did someone try to drown you, Waif? Were you a puppy someone didn't want? It's all right. I'm not going near this water either. I've no idea how to swim." As she turned left through the gateway, it occurred to her that swimming was only one of a very large number of things she had no idea how to do. Peter had been right to object to her ignorance. "It's not that I'm lazy," she explained to Waif, as they arrived in what seemed to be the stables, "or stupid. I've just not bothered to look round the edges of Mother's way of doing things, you see." The stables were rather smelly. Charmaine was relieved to see that the horses that must belong there were up in a meadow beyond a fence. Horses were another thing she had no idea about. At least Waif did not seem to be frightened here. Charmaine sighed, put Waif down, scrabbled up her glasses,
and looked at the confusing, swirly chart again. Stables were here up in the mountains somewhere. She needed 2 right turns from there to the kitchen again. She turned right twice, with Waif pattering behind, and found herself in near dark outside what seemed to be a large cave full of hurrying blue kobolds. Each one of them turned and glowered at Charmaine. Charmaine hurriedly turned right again, and this time she was in a store for cups, plates, and teapots. Waif whined. Charmaine stared at several hundred teapots, in rows on shelves, of every possible colour and size, and began to panic. It was getting late. Worse than that, when she put her glasses on again and consulted the plan, she found she was somewhere near the bottom left-hand part of the swirls, where the arrow pointing off to the edge had a note that said, "A group of lubberkins live down this way, care necessary." "Oh," Charmaine exclaimed, "this is ridiculous. Come on, Waif." She opened the door they had just come through and turned right yet again. This time they were in complete darkness. Charmaine could feel Waif nosing anxiously up against her ankles. Both of them sniffed, and Charmaine said, "Ah." This place had a damp stone smell that she remembered from the day she had arrived in the house. "Great-Uncle William," she asked, "how do I get from here to the kitchen again?" Much to her relief, the kindly voice answered. It sounded very faint and far away now.
"If you are there, my dear, you are rather lost. So listen carefully. Make 1 turn clockwise."
Charmaine had no need to listen any more. Instead of making a complete turn, she turned carefully halfway and then peered forward. Sure enough, there was a dimly lighted stone corridor ahead, crossing the one she seemed to be standing in. She strode thankfully toward it, with Waif trotting behind her, and turned into that corridor. She knew she was now in the royal mansion. It was the same corridor where she had seen Sim pushing a trolley on her first day in Great-Uncle William's house. Not only did it smell right, with faint foody smells on top of the damp stone smell, but the walls had the typical royal mansion look, with lighter squares and oblongs where pictures had been taken away. The only trouble was that she had no idea whereabouts in the mansion this was. Waif was no help. She simply plastered herself against Charmaine's ankles and shivered. Charmaine picked Waif up and walked down the corridor, hoping to find somewhere she knew. She turned 2 corners without being any the wiser, and then almost ran into the colourless gentleman who had passed the crumpets round yesterday. He jumped backward, thoroughly startled.
"Dear me," he said, peering at Charmaine in the gloom. "I had no idea you had arrived yet, Miss... Charming, is it? Are you lost? Can I assist?"
"Yes, please," Charmaine said resourcefully. "I went to the, you know, the one for ladies, and I must have turned the wrong way afterward. Can you tell me the way back to the library?"
"I can do better than that," said the colourless gentleman. "I'll show you. Just follow me."
He turned round and led the way back where he had been coming from, along another dim corridor and across a large, cold lobby, where a flight of stone stairs led upward. Waif's tail began to twitch slightly, as if she found this part familiar, but her tail stopped moving as they crossed in front of the stairs. Morgan's voice came booming down from the top of the flight. "Don't want to! Don't want! Don't want!" Twinkle's shriller voice joined in. "I can't wear these. I want my stripy ones." Sophie Pendragon's voice echoed down too. "Be quiet, both of you, or I'll do something dreadful. I warn you, I've no patience left." The colourless gentleman winced. He said to Charmaine,
"Small children bring so much life to a place, don't they?"
Charmaine looked up at him, meaning to nod and grin, but something made her shudder instead. She was not sure why. She managed to give a little nod, and that was all, before she followed the gentleman through an archway, where the booming of Morgan and the screaming of Twinkle died away into the distance. Round another corner, the colourless gentleman opened a door that Charmaine recognised as the door to the library. "Miss Charming seems to have arrived, sire," he said, bowing.
"Oh, good,"
said the king, looking up from a pile of thin leather books.
"Come in and sit down, my dear. I found an absolute heap of papers for you last night. I'd no idea we had so many."
Charmaine felt as if she'd never been away. Waif settled down, rolled tummy upward in the heat from the brazier. Charmaine settled down also, in front of a toppling heap of different-sized papers, found pen and paper, and started in. It was very companionable. After a while the king said,
"This ancestor of mine who wrote these diaries fancied himself as a poet. What do you think of this one? To his lady love, of course. You dance with the grace of a goat, my love, and you sing soft like a cow on the mountains. Would you call that romantic, my dear?"
Charmaine laughed. "It's dreadful." I hope she threw him over. Your Majesty, who is the colour... the gentleman who showed me in just now?"
"You mean my steward?" the king said. "Do you know, he's been with us for years and years and years, and I can never remember the poor fellow's name. You'll have to ask the princess, my dear. She remembers things like that."
Oh, well, Charmaine thought, I shall just have to think of him as the colourless gentleman, then. The day passed peacefully. It made, Charmaine felt, a pleasant change after such a hectic start. She sorted out and made notes about bills from 200 years ago, bills from 100 years ago, and bills from a mere 40 years back. Oddly enough, the older bills were for much larger sums of money than the newer ones. It looked as if the royal mansion was spending less and less. Charmaine also sorted out letters from 400 years back and more recent reports from ambassadors, from Strangia, Ingari, and even Rajput. Some ambassadors sent poems. Charmaine read the worst ones out to the king. Farther down the stack, she came upon receipts. Papers saying things like, "In payment for portrait of a lady reputed to be by a Grand Master 200 guineas," began to turn up more and more frequently, all from the last 60 years. It looked to Charmaine as if the royal mansion had been selling its pictures for most of the king's reign. She decided not to ask the king about it. Lunch arrived, more of Jamal's delicious spicy things. When Sim brought them, Waif jumped up, wagging her tail, stopped, looked disappointed, and trotted away out of the library. Charmaine had no idea if it was the cook's dog or lunch that Waif wanted. Lunch, probably. As Sim put the platter on the table, the king asked jovially,
"How are things going out there now, Sim?"
"A little noisily, sire," Sim replied. "We have just received our 6th rocking horse. Master Morgan seems desirous of a live monkey, which, I am glad to report, Mrs. Pendragon has refused to allow him to have. A certain uproar resulted. In addition, Master Twinkle seems convinced that someone is denying him a pair of stripy trousers. He has been very loud on the subject all morning, sire, and the fire demon has adopted the fire in the front parlour as his roosting place of choice. Will you be taking tea with us in the front parlour today, sire?"
"I think not," the king said. "I've nothing against the fire demon, but it gets a bit crowded in there with all those rocking horses. Be good enough to fetch us some crumpets here to the library, if you will, Sim."
"Certainly, sire,"
Sim said. shakily backing from the room. When the door was shut, the king said to Charmaine,
"It's not the rocking horses, really, and I quite like the noise, but it all makes me think how much I'd have enjoyed being a grandfather. Pity that."
Said Charmaine, "people in town always say that Princess Hilda was disappointed in love. Is that why she never married?" The king seemed surprised.
"Not that I know of," he said. "She had princes and dukes lining up to marry her for years when she was younger, but she's not the marrying kind. Never fancied the idea, so she tells me. Prefers her life here, helping me. It's a pity, though. Here's my heir having to be Prince Ludovic, my fool of a cousin's son. You'll meet him soon, if we can only move a rocking horse or so. Or maybe she'll use the grand parlour instead. But the real pity is that there are no more youngsters around the mansion nowadays. I miss that."
The king did not seem too unhappy. He looked matter-of-fact rather than mournful, but Charmaine was suddenly struck by what a sad place the royal mansion really was. Huge, empty, and sad. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said. The king grinned and bit into a Jamal tasty.
"I know you do," he said. "You're a very intelligent young lady. You'll do your great-uncle William great credit one day."
Charmaine blinked a bit at this description, but before she could get too uncomfortable at being praised, she realized what the king had left out. "I may be clever," she thought quite sadly, "but I'm not in the least kind or sympathetic. I think I may even be hard-hearted. Look at the way I treat Peter." She brooded on this for the rest of the afternoon. The result was that when it was time to stop for the day and Sim reappeared with Waif wandering along after him, Charmaine stood up and said, "Thank you for being so good to me, Your Majesty." The king seemed surprised and told her to think nothing of it. "But I do," Charmaine thought. "He's been so kind that it should be a lesson to me." As she followed Sim's slow totter with Waif, who seemed very sleepy and fat, toiling along behind both of them, Charmaine made a resolution to be kind to Peter when she got back to Great-Uncle William's house. Sim had almost reached the front door when Twinkle came rushing past from somewhere, energetically bowling a large hoop. He was followed at speed by Morgan, holding both arms out and bellowing, "Oop! Oop! Oop!" Sim was sent reeling. Charmaine tried to flatten herself against the wall as Twinkle shot past. There was an instant when she thought that Twinkle gave her a strange, searching look as he whipped by, but a yelp from Waif sent her speeding to the rescue, and she thought no more about it. Waif had been knocked upside down and was very upset about it. Charmaine scooped her up and nearly ran into Sophie Pendragon, chasing after Morgan. "Which way?" Sophie panted. Charmaine pointed. Sophie hauled her skirts high and raced off, muttering something about guts and garters as she ran. Princess Hilda appeared in the distance and stopped to drag Sim to his feet. "I really do apologize, Miss Charming," she said as Charmaine reached her. "That child is like an eel. Well, they both are, actually. I shall have to take steps, or poor Sophie will have no attention left for our problems. Are you steady now, Sim?"
"Perfectly, Ma'am,"
said Sim. He bowed to Charmaine and let her out through the front door into bright afternoon sunlight, as if nothing had happened. "If I ever marry," Charmaine thought, striding across Royal Square with Waif in her arms, "I shall never have children. They would make me cruel and hard-hearted after a week. Perhaps I shall be like Princess Hilda and never marry. That way I might stand a chance of learning to be kind. Anyway, I shall practice on Peter, because he's truly hard work." She was full of sternly kind resolve when she reached Great-Uncle William's house. It helped, as she marched up the path between the ranks of blue hydrangeas, that there was no sign of Rollo. Being kind to Rollo was something Charmaine was sure she could never do. Not humanly possible, she remarked to herself as she put waif down on the living-room carpet. The room struck her as being unusually clean and tidy. Everything was orderly, from the suitcase neatly put back beside one of the armchairs to the vase of variously coloured hydrangeas on the coffee table. Charmaine frowned at this vase. It was surely the one that had disappeared when it was put on the trolley. Maybe Peter ordered morning coffee, and it came back then, she thought, rather vaguely, because she suddenly remembered that she had left damp clothing all over her bedroom and bedclothes trailing over the floor. Bother, I have to tidy up. She stopped short in the doorway of her bedroom. Someone had made her bed. Her clothes, dry now, were neatly folded on top of the chest of drawers. It was an outrage. Feeling anything but kind, Charmaine stormed into the kitchen. Peter was sitting at the kitchen table looking so virtuous that Charmaine knew he had been up to something. Behind him, on the fire, a large black pot was bubbling out strange, weak, savoury smells. "What do you mean by tidying up my room?" Charmaine demanded. Peter looked injured, even though Charmaine could tell he was full of secret, exciting thoughts. "I thought you'd be pleased," he said. "Well, I'm not," Charmaine said. She was surprised to find herself almost in tears. "I was just beginning to learn that if I drop something on the floor, it stays dropped unless I pick it up, and if I make a mess, I have to clear it away because it doesn't go by itself, and then you go and clear it up for me. You're as bad as my mother." "I've got to do something while I'm alone here all day," Peter protested. "Or do you expect me to just sit here?" "You can do anything you like," Charmaine yelled. "Dance, stand on your head, make faces at Rollo, but don't spoil my learning process." "Feel free to learn," Peter retorted. "You've got a long way to go. I won't touch your room again. Are you interested in some of the things I've learnt today, or are you thoroughly self-centred?" Charmaine gulped. "I was meaning to be kind to you this evening, but you make it very difficult." "My mother says difficulties help you learn," Peter said. "You should be pleased. I'll tell you one thing I've learnt today, and that's how to get enough supper." He pointed with his thumb to the bubbling pot. That thumb had a piece of green string round it. The other thumb had red string, and one of his fingers was decorated with blue string. "He's been trying to go in 3 directions at once," Charmaine thought. Striving mightily to sound friendly, she said, "How do you get enough supper, then?" "I kept banging on the pantry door," Peter said, "until enough things landed on the table. Then I put them in that pot to boil." Charmaine looked at the pot. "What things?" "Liver and bacon," Peter said, "cabbage, more turnips, and a chunk of rabbit, onions, 2 more chops, and a leek. It was easy, really." "Yuck," thought Charmaine. In order not to say something really rude, she turned round to go to the living-room. Peter called after her, "Don't you want to know how I got that vase of flowers back?" "You sat on the trolley," Charmaine said coldly, and went away to read the 12-branched wand. But it was no good. She kept looking up and seeing that vase of hydrangeas, and then looking over at the trolley, and wondering if Peter had truly sat there and vanished away with an afternoon tea, then wondering how he had got back. And every time she looked, she was more aware that her resolve to be kind to Peter had come to absolutely nothing. She stood it for nearly an hour, and then went back to the kitchen. "I apologize," she said. "How did you get the flowers back?" Peter was prodding at the stuff in the pot with a spoon. "I don't think this is ready yet," he said. "This spoon bounces off." "Oh, come on," Charmaine said. "I'm being polite." "I'll tell you over supper," Peter said. He kept his word, maddeningly. He hardly said a word for an hour, until the contents of the pot had been shared into 2 bowls. Dividing the food was not easy, because Peter had not bothered to peel anything or cut it up before he put it in the pot. They had to hack the cabbage apart with 2 spoons. Nor had Peter remembered that a stew needs salt. Everything, white soggy bacon, hunk of rabbit, whole turnip and flabby onion, floated in weak watery juice. To put it mildly, the food was quite horrible. Doing her best to be kind, Charmaine did not say it was. The only good thing was that Waif liked it. That is to say, she lapped up the weak juice and then carefully ate the meaty bits out from among the cabbage. Charmaine did much the same and tried not to shudder. She was glad to take her mind off it by listening to what Peter had to tell. "Are you aware," he began, rather pompously to Charmaine's mind, but she could tell that he had everything worked out in his mind like a story, and was going to tell it just as he had it worked out. "Are you aware that when things vanish from the trolley, they go back into the past?" "Well, I suppose the past makes quite a good waste dump," Charmaine said. "As long as you make sure it really is past and things don't turn up again all mouldy." "Do you want to hear or not?" Peter demanded. "Be kind," Charmaine told herself. She ate another piece of nasty cabbage and nodded. "And that parts of this house are in the past," Peter continued. "I didn't sit on the trolley, you know. I just went exploring with a list of the ways I needed to turn, and I found out by accident, really. I must have turned the wrong way once or twice." "Doesn't surprise me," Charmaine thought. "Anyway," said Peter, "I got to a place where there were hundreds of kobold ladies all washing teapots and stacking food on trays for breakfast and teas and things, and I was a bit nervous of them because of the way you'd annoyed them over the hydrangeas, but I tried to look pleasant as I went by and nodded and smiled and things, and I was really surprised when they all nodded and smiled back and said good morning in a perfectly friendly way. So I went on nodding and smiling and walking past until I came to a room I hadn't seen before. As soon as I opened the door, the first thing I saw was that vase of flowers sitting on the front of a long, long table. The next thing I saw was Wizard Norland sitting behind the table." "Good gracious," said Charmaine. "It surprised me too," Peter admitted. "I just stood there and stared, to tell the truth. He looked quite healthy, you know, strong and pink, and he had a lot more hair than I remembered, and he was busy working on the chart that was in the suitcase. He had it all spread out along the table, and he'd only filled in about a quarter of it. I suppose that gave me a clue. Anyway, he looked up and said quite politely, 'Would you mind closing the door? There's quite a draught.' Then before I could say anything, he looked up again and said, 'Who on earth are you?' I said, 'I'm Peter Regis.' That made him frown. He said, 'Regis, Regis, does that make you some relation of the Witch of Montalbino, perhaps?' 'She's my mother,' I said, and he said, 'I didn't think she had any children.' 'She only has me,' I said. 'My dad was killed in a big avalanche at Transmontane just after I was born.' He frowned some more and said, 'But that avalanche was only last month, young man. They're saying that a Lubbock set it off, and it certainly killed a lot of people. Or are we talking about the avalanche 40 years ago?' And he looked very stern and disbelieving at me. I wondered how I could make him believe what had happened. I said, 'I promise it's true. Some of your house must go back in time. It's where the afternoon teas disappeared to, and, this should prove it, we put that vase of flowers on the trolley the other day, and it came back here to you.' He looked at the vase, but he didn't say anything. I said, 'I came here to your house because my mother arranged for me to be your apprentice.' He said, 'Did she indeed? I must have been wanting to oblige her quite badly then. You don't seem to me to have any remarkable talent.' 'I can do magic,' I said, 'but my mother can arrange anything when she wants to.' He said, 'True, she has a remarkably forceful personality. What did I say when you turned up?' 'You didn't,'
I said. You weren't there. A girl called Charmaine Baker was looking after your house. Or she was supposed to be, but she went off and worked for the king and met a fire demon. He interrupted me then, looking shocked. A fire demon? Young man, those are very dangerous beings. Are you telling me that the Witch of the Waste will be in High Norland before long? No, no, I said. One of the royal wizards in Ingery did for the Witch of the Waste nearly 3 years ago now. This one was something to do with the king, Charmaine said. I suppose she's only just born from your point of view, but she said you were ill, and the elves carried you off to cure you, and her Aunt Sempronia arranged for Charmaine to look after the house while you were gone. He looked quite upset about this. He sat back in his chair and blinked a bit. I have a great niece called Sempronia, he said, sort of slowly and thinking about it. This could be so. Sempronia has married into a very respectable family, I believe. Oh, they are, I said. You should just see Charmaine's mother. She's so respectable she doesn't let Charmaine do anything. Thank you very much, Peter, Charmaine thought. Now he thinks I'm a complete waste of space. But he wasn't really interested, Peter went on. He wanted to know what had made him ill, and I couldn't tell him. Do you know? He asked Charmaine. Charmaine shook her head. Peter shrugged and said. Then he sighed and said he supposed it didn't matter because it seemed to have been unavoidable. But after that, he said, quite pathetically and all puzzled, but I don't know any elves. I said, Charmaine said it was the king who sent the elves. Oh, he said, and he looked much happier. Course it would be. The royal family has elf blood. Several of them married elves, and the elves do keep up the connection, I believe. Then he looked at me and said, so this story begins to hang together. I said, well, it should do. It's all true. But what I don't understand is what you did to make the kobolds so angry with you. Nothing, I assure you, he said. Kobolds are my friends, they have been for years. They do a great many tasks for me. I would no more anger a kobold than I would anger my friend the king. He seemed annoyed enough about this that I thought I'd better change the subject. I said, then can I ask you about this house? Did you build it or find it? Oh, found it, he said. Or at least I bought it when I was quite a young struggling wizard, because it seemed small and cheap. Then I found it was a labyrinth of many ways. It was a delightful discovery, I can tell you. It seems once to have belonged to a wizard Melicott, the same man who made the roof of the royal mansion appear to be gold. I have always hoped that somewhere inside this house there is hidden the actual gold that was in the royal treasury at the time. The king has been looking for that for years, you know. And you can guess how that made me prick up my ears, Peter said. But I never got to ask any more, because he said, looking at the vase on the table, so these are really flowers from the future, then. Do you mind telling me what sort they are? I was quite astonished he didn't know. I told him they were hydrangeas from his own garden. The coloured ones the kobolds cut off, I said, and he looked at them and murmured that they were quite magnificent, particularly the way they were so many different colours. I shall have to start growing them for myself, he said. They have more colours than roses. You can get them to grow blue, too, I said. My mother uses a spell with copper powder for ours. And while he was murmuring about that, I asked him if I could take them back with me so that I could prove to you that I'd met him. Certainly, certainly, he said. They are rather in the way here, and tell your young lady, who knows the fire demon, that I hope to have my chart of the house finished by the time she's grown up enough to need it. So, Peter said, I took the flowers and came away. Wasn't that extraordinary? Very, said Charmaine. He wouldn't have grown hydrangeas.
if the kobolds hadn't cut them off, and I hadn't picked them up, and you hadn't got lost. Makes my head go round." She pushed aside her bowlful of cabbage and turnip. "I shall be nice to him. I shall. Peter, how would it be if I called in on my father on my way home tomorrow and asked him for a cookery book? He must have hundreds. He's the best cook in town." Peter looked utterly relieved. "Good idea," he said. "My mother's never told me much about cooking. She always does it all. And I shan't object to the way he's made Great Uncle William think of me," Charmaine vowed. "I shall be kind. But if he does that once again—" Chapter 10, in which Twinkle takes to the roof. In the night, a worrying thought struck Charmaine. If you could travel in time in Great Uncle William's house, what was to stop her arriving in the royal mansion 10 years ago to find that the king was not expecting her? Or 10 years in the future, to find that Prince Ludovic was ruling now? It was enough to make her decide to walk to the mansion in the usual way. So the next morning Charmaine set off along the road with Waif pattering behind her until they came by the cliff where the Lovelock's meadow was, when Waif became so breathless and pathetic that Charmaine picked her up. As usual, Charmaine thought. "I feel like a proper grown-up working girl," she added to herself as she strode toward town with Waif happily trying to lick her chin. It had rained in the night again, but now it was one of those mornings of pale blue sky and huge white clouds. The mountains were silky blues and greens, and in the town the sun glittered off wet cobbles and flared on the river. Charmaine felt very contented. She was really looking forward to a day of sorting papers and chatting with the king. As she crossed Royal Square, the sun glared so off the golden roof of the royal mansion that Charmaine was forced to look down at the cobbles. Waif blinked and ducked and then jumped as a loud squealing sound came from the mansion. "Look at me! Look at me!" Charmaine looked, found her eyes full of tears from the dazzle, and looked again under a hand spared from Waif. The child, Twinkle, was sitting astride the golden roof, fully 100 feet in the air, waving merrily to her. He almost overbalanced doing it. At the sight, Charmaine forgot all the unkind thoughts she had had about children yesterday. She dumped Waif on the cobbles and ran for the mansion door, where she clattered at the great knocker and rang the bell furiously. "That little boy!" she gasped at Sim when he slowly and creakily opened the door. "Twinkle! He's sitting on the roof. Someone has to get him down."
"Is that so?"
said Sim. He tottered out onto the steps. Charmaine had to wait while he tottered to a place where he could see the roof and craned shakily upward.
"Indeed he is, miss," he agreed. "Little demon, he'll fall. That roof is as slippery as ice."
Charmaine was jigging with impatience by then. "Send someone to fetch him in, quickly."
"I don't know who," Sim said slowly. "Nobody much in this mansion climbs too well. I could send Jamal, I suppose, but with only the one eye, his balance is not too good."
Waif was prancing about, yapping to be carried up the steps. Charmaine ignored her. "Then send me," she said. "Just tell me how to get there, now, before he slides off sideways."
"Good notion," Sim agreed. "You take the stairs at the end of the hall, miss, and keep on going up. Last flight's wooden, and you'll find a small door."
Charmaine waited for no more. Leaving Waif to fend for herself, she raced off down the damp stone corridor until she came to the lobby with the stone stairs. There she began to climb for dear life, with her glasses bouncing on her chest and her footsteps ringing round the walls. Up she went, 2 long flights, her mind filled with horrible thoughts of a small body plummeting down and hitting the cobbles with, well, a splash, just about where she had left Waif. Panting hard, she hurried up a 3rd, narrower flight. It seemed endless. Then she came to wooden stairs and clattered up those, almost out of breath. They seemed endless, too. At last she came to a small wooden door. Praying she was still in time, Charmaine flung open the door onto a blaze of sunlight and gold. "I thought you were never coming," Twinkle said from the middle of the roof. He was wearing a pale blue velvet suit, and his golden hair blazed as bright as the roof. He seemed perfectly calm, more like a strayed angel than a small boy in trouble on a roof. "Are you very frightened?" Charmaine panted anxiously. "Hold on very tight and don't move, and I'll crawl out and get you." "Please do that," Twinkle said politely. "He doesn't know the danger he's in," Charmaine thought. "I shall have to keep very calm." Very cautiously, she climbed out through the wooden door and manoeuvred until she was sitting astride the roof like Twinkle. It was highly uncomfortable. Charmaine did not know which was worse, the fact that the tin tiles were hot, wet, sharp, and slippery, or the way the roof seemed to be cutting her in two. When she snatched a sideways look at Royal Square, far, far below, she had to remind herself very seriously that she had worked a spell only 3 days ago that had saved her from the lubbock and proved that she could fly. She might be able to grab Twinkle round his waist and float down with him. Here she realized that Twinkle was moving backward away from her as she worked her way toward him. "Stop that," she said. "Don't you know how dangerous this is?" "Of course I do," Twinkle retorted. "Heights scare me silly, but this is the only place where I can talk to you without anyone overhearing. Just get yourself to the middle of the roof where I don't have to shout, and be quick. Princess Hilda has hired a nursemaid for Morgan and me. The wretched girl will be along any minute now." This sounded so grown up that Charmaine blinked and stared at him. Twinkle smiled blindingly back, all big blue eyes and enchanting rosy lips. "Are you an infant genius or something?" she asked him. "Well, I am now," Twinkle said. "When I was really 6 years old, I was about average, I think. With a strong gift for magic, of course. Move along, can't you?" "I'm trying." Charmaine set herself to shunting along the roof until she was only a foot or so away from the child. "So what are we supposed to be talking about?" she snapped into his face. "Wizard Norland first," Twinkle said. "They tell me you know him." "Not really," Charmaine said. "He's my great-aunt by marriage's great-uncle. I'm keeping house for him while he's ill." She did not feel like mentioning Peter. "And what is his house like?" Twinkle asked. He added chattily, "I live in a moving castle myself. Does Norland's house move?" "No," said Charmaine, "but there's a door in the middle that takes you to about 100 different rooms. They say Wizard Melicott made it." "Ah, Melicott," Twinkle piped. He seemed very pleased. "Then I'll probably need to come and see it, whatever Calcifer says. Is that all right?" "I suppose so," Charmaine said. "Why?" "Because," Twinkle explained, "Sophie, Calcifer, and I have been hired to find out what became of the gold in the king's treasury. At least, we think that's what they're wanting, but they're not being very clear. Half the time they seem to be saying that what they've lost is something called the elf gift, and nobody knows what this elf gift is. And the princess has asked Sophie to find out what keeps happening to the money from the taxes, and that seems to be something different again. They've sold a lot of pictures and other things, and they're still as poor as church mice. You must have noticed." Charmaine nodded. "I noticed. Couldn't they ask for more taxes?" "Or sell some of their library?" Twinkle suggested. He shrugged. This made him sway about so precariously that Charmaine shut her eyes. "Calcifer nearly got ordered to leave last night when he suggested selling some books. And as for taxes, the king says high Norland people are well off and contented, and any extra tax money would probably just disappear too, though that's no good. What I want you to do—" There was a shout down in the distance. Charmaine opened her eyes and looked sideways. Quite a number of people had gathered in the square, all shading their eyes and pointing to the roof. "Hurry up," she said. "They'll be calling out the fire brigade any minute now." "Do they have one?" Twinkle asked. "They're civilized you are here." He smiled another of his blazing smiles. "What we need you to do." "Are you two quite happy out here?" a voice asked close behind Charmaine. It was so near and so sudden that Charmaine jumped and all but overbalanced. "What's it, Sophie?" Twinkle said urgently. "You nearly had her off, then?" "That just goes to show what a harebrained scheme this was, even for you," Sophie said. By the sound, she was leaning out of the wooden door, but Charmaine did not dare turn round to look. "Have you done the magic I gave you?" Twinkle asked, leaning sideways to talk round Charmaine. "Yes, I have," Sophie said. "Everyone's running around the mansion, fussing. Calcifer's trying to stop that silly nursemaid having hysterics, and someone outside has just called the fireman in. I managed to slip into the library with your spell in the confusion. Satisfied?" "Perfectly." Twinkle gave another angelic smile. "You see how cunning my plan was now?" He leaned toward Charmaine. "What I've done," he said to her, "is to cast a spell that makes every book or piece of paper that has the slightest bearing on the king's problems light up with a light that only you can see. When you spot a lighted one, I want you to make a note of which it is and what it says. Secretly, of course. Something is definitely wrong here, and we don't want anyone to know what you're doing, in case it gets to the person causing the trouble. Can you do that for us?" "I suppose so," said Charmaine. It sounded easy enough, although she did not like the idea of keeping secrets from the king. "When do you want my notes?" "Tonight, please, before that princely heir gets here," Sophie said from behind Charmaine. "There's no need to get him mixed up in this, and we're very grateful, and it truly is important. It's the reason why we're here. Now, for goodness sake, come inside, both of you, before they start putting up ladders." "All right," Twinkle piped. "Here we go. I may arrive in 2 halves, mind you." "Serve you right," said Sophie. The roof started to buck and ripple under Charmaine. She nearly screamed, but she clung on with both hands, reminding herself that she really could fly, couldn't she? And the roof jiggled and rippled her backward toward the way she had come out, while in front of her, Twinkle jiggled onward too. In moments, Charmaine felt Sophie take hold of her under her armpits and lug her backward, with a bit of a scramble, inside the royal mansion again. Sophie then leaned out and seized Twinkle and dumped him down beside Charmaine. Twinkle looked soulfully up at Charmaine. "Back to infancy again," he said, sighing. "You won't give me away, will you?" "Oh, cut out the nonsense," Sophie said. "Charmaine's all right." She said to Charmaine, "His name's Howl, really, and he's enjoying himself quite disgustingly much, having his second childhood. Come along, my little man." She swept Twinkle up under one arm and carried him away down the stairs. There was a lot of kicking and screaming. Charmaine followed them, shaking her head. On the main landing halfway down, everyone in the mansion seemed to be gathered, including a number of people Charmaine had not seen before, with Calcifer bobbing this way and that among them. Even the king was there, carrying waif in an absent-minded way. Princess Hilda pushed aside a fat young woman who was holding Morgan and sobbing, and shook Charmaine's hand. "My dear Miss Charming, thank you so very much. We were in such a panic. Sim, go and tell the fireman we don't need the ladders, and we certainly don't need the hoses." Charmaine could hardly hear her. Waif had seen Charmaine, and she promptly leapt from the king's arms, yapping with hysterical relief that Charmaine was safe. From somewhere in the background, Jamal's dog answered with mournful howlings. The fat nursemaid went, "Sniff!" Morgan bellowed, "Oof! Oof!" and everyone else jabbered. In the distance, Twinkle was yelling, "I am not naughty. I was very frightened, I tell you." Charmaine cut down some of the noise by scooping waif up. Princess Hilda silenced most of the rest by clapping her hands and saying, "Back to work, everyone.
Nancy, take Morgan away before he deafens us all, and make it very clear to him that he is not going out on the roof too. Sophie, dear, can you shut Twinkle up?"
Everyone moved away. Twinkle went,
"I am not a naughty—"
and then stopped, as if a hand had been clapped across his mouth. In next to no time, Charmaine found herself walking down the rest of the stairs with the king on the way to the library, with Waif ecstatically trying to lick her chin.
"It takes me right back," the king remarked. "I got out on the roof several times when I was a boy. Never failed to cause a silly panic. Fireman nearly hosed me off once by mistake. Boys will be boys, my dear. Are you ready to get down to work, or will you want to sit and recover a bit?"
"No, I'm fine," Charmaine assured him. She felt completely at home today as she settled into her seat in the library, surrounded by the smell of old books, with Waif toasting her tummy at the brazier, and the king sitting opposite investigating a ragged pile of old diaries. So peaceful was it that Charmaine all but forgot about Twinkle's spell. She became immersed in peeling apart a damp pile of old letters. They were all from a long-ago prince who was breeding horses and wanted his mother to coax more money out of the king. The prince was just feelingly describing the beauties of the new foal his best mare had given birth to, when Charmaine looked up to see the fire demon flickering slowly this way and that around the library. The king looked up too.
"Good morning, Calcifer," he said courteously. "Is there something you need?" "Just exploring," Calcifer answered in his small, crackling voice. "I understand now why you might not want to sell these books." "Indeed," said the king. "Tell me, do fire demons read much?" "Not generally," Calcifer replied. "Sophie reads to me quite often. I like the kind of story with puzzles in, where you have to guess who did the murder. Have you any of those in here?" "Probably not," said the king. "But my daughter is partial to murder mysteries too. Perhaps you should ask her." "Thank you, I will," Calcifer said, and vanished. The king shook his head and went back to his diaries. And, as if Calcifer had given Twinkle's spell a jog, Charmaine instantly noticed that the diary the king was flipping through was glowing a faint pale green. So was the next thing in her own pile, which was a rather squashed scroll done up with tarnished golden tape. Charmaine took a large breath and asked, "Anything interesting in that diary, sire?" "Well," said the king, "it's rather nasty, really. This is the diary of one of my great-grandmother's ladies-in-waiting, full of gossip. Just now she's dreadfully shocked because the king's sister died giving birth to a son, and the midwife seems to have killed the baby. Said it was purple, and it frightened her. They're going to put the poor silly soul on trial for murder." Charmaine's mind flew to herself and Peter looking up Lubbock in Great-Uncle William's encyclopedia. She said, "I suppose she thought the baby was a Lubbocken." "Yeah, very superstitious and ignorant," the king said. "No one believes in Lubbockins these days." He went back to reading. Charmaine wondered whether to say that long-ago midwife may have been quite right. Lubbocks existed. Why not Lubbockins too? But she was sure the king would not believe her, and she scribbled a note about it instead. Then she picked up the squashed scroll, but before she unrolled it, it occurred to her to look along the row of boxes where she had put the papers she had already read, in case any of them glowed too. Only one did, quite faintly. When Charmaine pulled it out, she found it was the bill from Wizard Melicott for making the roof look like gold. This was puzzling, but Charmaine made a note about that too, before she finally undid the tarnished gold tape and spread the scroll out. It was a family tree of the kings of High Norland, rather scribbly and hasty, as if it was only a plan for a much more careful copy. Charmaine had trouble reading it.
It was full of crossings out and little arrows leading to scribbled additions and lopsided circles with notes inside them. "Sire," she said, "can you explain this to me?"
"Let's see."
The king took the scroll and spread it out on the table.
"Ah," he said, "we've got the fair copy of this hanging in the throne room. I haven't properly looked at it for years, but I know it's much plainer than this family tree, just names of rulers and who they married and so on. This one seems to have notes on it, written by several different people by the looks of it. See, here's my ancestor, Adolphus the First. The note beside him is in really old writing. It says, raised walls to the town by virtue of the elf gift. Not much sign of those walls nowadays, is there? But they say that Embankment Street down beside the river is part of the old walls."
"Excuse me, sire," Charmaine interrupted, "but what is the elf gift?"
"No idea, my dear," the king said. "I wish I knew. It was said to bring prosperity and protection to the kingdom, whatever it was, but it seems to have vanished long ago." This is fascinating."
The king ran his large finger across to one note after another.
"Here, beside my ancestor's wife, it says, 'Was elf woman so called?' They always told me that Queen Matilda was only half elf. But here is her son, Hans Nicholas, labelled as elf child. So maybe that's why he never got to be king. Nobody really trusts elves. Great mistake, in my opinion. They crowned Hans Nicholas's son instead, a very boring person called Adolphus II, who never did anything much. He's the one king on this scroll who doesn't have a note beside him. Tells you something. But his son, here he is, Hans Peter Adolphus, he has a note that says, 'Reaffirm the safety of the realm in partnership with the elf gift,' whatever that means. My dear, this is so interesting. Would you do me the favour of making a good readable copy of all these people's names and the notes beside them? You can miss out cousins and things if they don't have notes. Would you mind very much?"
"Not at all, sire," Charmaine said. She had been wondering how she could write all this down secretly for Sophie and Twinkle, and this was how. She spent the rest of that day making 2 copies of the scroll. One was a muddly first draft, where she was constantly having to ask the king about this note or that one, and the second copy was in her best writing for the king himself. She became as interested as the king was. Why did Hans Peter III's nephew take to banditry in the hills? What made Queen Gertrude a witch to be feared? And why was her daughter, Princess Isola, labelled Blue Man Lover? The king could not answer those questions, but he said he had a good idea why Prince Nicholas Adolphus was labelled Drunkard. Had Charmaine looked at where it said the prince's father, Peter Hans IV, was called a dark tyrant and a wizard besides? "Some of my ancestors were not nice people," he said. "I bet this one bullied poor Nicholas horribly. They tell me it can be like that when elf blood goes sour, but I think it's just people, really." Quite late in the day, when Charmaine was down near the bottom of the scroll, where nearly every ruler seemed to be called Adolphus, or Adolphus Nicholas, or Ludovic Adolphus, she was fascinated to come upon a Princess Moina, who married a great lord of Strangia, but died giving birth to a loathsome lubberkin. Charmaine was sure Moina was the one in the lady-in-waiting's diary. It looked as if someone had believed the midwife's story. She decided not to mention this to the king. 3 lines farther down she came upon the king himself, much lost among his books, and Princess Hilda refused marriage with a king, 3 lords, and a wizard. They were rather squeezed to one side to make room for the descendants of the king's uncle, Nicholas Peter, who seemed to have had a great many children. The children's children filled the whole bottom row. How on earth do they remember who is which? Charmaine wondered. Half the girls were called Matilda and the other half Isola, while the boys were mostly Hans or Hans Adolphus. You could only tell them apart by the tiny scribbled notes calling one Hans a great lout drowned, and another murdered by accident, and yet another died abroad. The girls were worse. One Matilda was a tedious proud girl, another to be feared like Queen Gertrude, and a third of no good nature. The Isolas were all either poisoned or of evil ways. The king's heir, Ludovic Nicholas, stood out from what Charmaine began to think was a truly dreadful family by having no note beside him at all, like the dull Adolphus of long ago. She wrote it all out, names, notes, and all. By the end of the afternoon, her right forefinger was quite numb and blue with ink.
"Thank you, my dear,"
the king said, as Charmaine handed him her good copy. He started reading through it so eagerly that Charmaine was easily able to gather up her scribbly copy and her other notes and cram them into her pockets, without the king seeing. As she stood up, the king looked up to say,
"I hope you will forgive me, my dear. I shall not be needing you for the next 2 days. The princess insists that I come out of the library and play host to young Prince Ludovic this weekend. She is not at her best with male visitors, you know, but I shall see you again on Monday, I hope."
"Yes, of course," Charmaine said. She collected Waif, who came pottering toward her from the kitchen, and set off toward the front door, wondering what to do with her copy of the scroll. She was not sure she trusted Twinkle. Could you trust someone who looked like a little boy and obviously wasn't, quite? And then there's what Peter said Great-Uncle William said about fire demons. Can you trust someone that dangerous? She thought unhappily as she went. She found herself face to face with Sophie. "How did it go? Did you find anything?" Sophie asked, smiling at her. It was such a friendly smile that Charmaine decided she could trust Sophie anyway. She hoped. "I got some things," she said, pulling papers out of her pockets. Sophie took them even more eagerly and gratefully than the king had taken his good copy. "Marvellous," she said. "These should at least give us a clue. We're really in the dark at the moment. Howl, Twinkle, says divining spells just don't seem to work here, and that's odd, because I don't think either the king or the princess do magic, do you? Enough to block a divining spell, I mean." "No," Charmaine said, "but a lot of their ancestors did, and there's more to the king than meets your eye." "You're right," said Sophie. "Are you able to stay and go through these notes with us?" "Ask me things on Monday," Charmaine told her. "I have to go and see my father before his bakery closes."